All right, is everybody in the room now? Right, welcome. I am Amanda Smith, Chair for the Mental Health and Resiliency Action Team Education Planning Committee. Thank you for joining us at our virtual wellness workshop. And thanks for taking the time to register when logging into the Zoom webinar this morning. This is how we're able to capture attendance. We'll begin shortly. You can use the chat feature to ask questions. Please also share in the chat box your name, title, and the organization that you're here with. And once again, for those of you just joining us, welcome. I'm Amanda Smith, Chair for the Mental Health and Resiliency Action Education Planning Committee. That's a mouthful. Thanks for joining us at our virtual wellness workshop. And thank you for taking the time to register when logging into the Zoom webinar this morning. This is how we're able to capture the attendance. We'll begin here shortly. In the meantime, you can share in the chat box your name, title, and the organization that you're here with. Let's go ahead and get started. So we'll have time for all of our wonderful speakers today. So good morning. Thank you all for being here. Please be aware that this session will be recorded and made available through the website and social media links to inform and educate the public on this topic. Throughout today's program, our speakers may ask for questions. Please use the raise your hand feature and we will unmute you to be able to ask your question. Keep in mind, if you choose to participate in an identifiable way, you acknowledge that your image and/or name will be recorded, and you are authorizing the use of your information in the recording as described. You have no obligation to appear or speak in the recording. The recording of today's workshop is protected by copyright law and is not to be copied. All right, welcome. So once again, I'm Amanda Smith, Chair for the Mental Health and Resiliency Action Team Education Planning Committee. Since 2014, the Wellness Alliance for Total Children's Health, otherwise known as WATCH, has provided wellness workshops to professionals and community members in Denton County to learn about children's mental health issues. We're so excited that 10 years later, the wellness workshops have grown to support professionals and other community members outside of Denton County. And we do so through a new group, the Mental Health and Resiliency Action Team, which continues to focus on sharing valuable information and resources throughout the region on mental health topics and adverse childhood events. For more information on this group and the resources it provides, please visit our website using the QR code on the slide. We have many people to thank for working collaboratively to put this event together. We'd like to thank members of the action team for planning and thinking through the program, Cook Children's for providing CEUs, and you, if you've attended our previous events, for providing feedback. We planned this program with you in mind. We'd also like to thank each of our speakers for giving their time and sharing their expertise with us today. With their permission, we will post the slides and video from today on the Center for Community Health website for ongoing CEUs. As a reminder, you can find past webinars on the Center for Community Health website, and you're able to earn CEUs for some of those also. We'll put the link for this in the chat. If you did not receive the meeting packet with your presenter slides, which should have come to you by email after you registered, you can also find that link placed in the chat. Once on the website, you will navigate to the Mental Health tab and then find today's presentation and click on Download PDF. Just a few more housekeeping details. I'll be hosting the workshop today along with Emily Russell, the program coordinator for the Mental Health Action Team. We invite you to engage with the speakers and other attendees in the chat box. You can talk with the group as a whole or one-on-one by clicking on the button next to the To field in the chat feature. This is located just above where you type your message. We will have time for questions at the end of each presentation. You can either use the chat box or Q&A box to ask your question. If you'd like to speak live, you can raise your hand and we can unmute you so that you can speak directly to the presenter. So today we will be discussing dysregulated youth and supportive interventions. From 9:10 to 10 o'clock, Shannon Ingbrecht with the Paluxy River Children's Advocacy Center will discuss what dysregulation is. And then from 10:10 to 10:55, Shannon will also discuss diagnoses associated with severe symptoms of dysregulation. Then from 11:05 to 12:30, Dr. Wendy Johnson, licensed psychologist with the TWU Department of School Psychology, will share interventions to support dysregulated youth, and Lauren Fouch will discuss additional therapeutic interventions and what to know regarding higher levels of care. We do not have scheduled breaks during our time together, but we will pause in between the presentations to take questions. Feel free to take a break during this time or whenever you may need. So for your convenience, we've created an event packet for you to use as you follow along with today's presentations. You should have received an email with a link to the event packet. If you did not receive this, once again, you can navigate to the website posted in the chat and follow the instructions to download the packet. An evaluation link for today's event will be shared at the end of the program. All are encouraged to complete the evaluation, and it is required to receive continuing education credit. You will also receive an email with the link to fill out the evaluation online in the event that you're not able to complete it at the end of our time today. You can also print out your certificate later when it's convenient for you. All right, so today's speakers have no conflicts of interest to report regarding today's presentation. I'm now pleased to introduce you to our first speaker, Shannon Ingbrecht. Shannon currently serves as the clinical director for the Paluxy River Children's Advocacy Center, and she has been in the field of child and family welfare for the last 5 years of practice. She has also recently entered into part-time private practice, treating children, teens, adults, and elderly populations for challenges in coping with life changes, trauma, caregiving support, depression, anxiety, and work stress. Shannon received her BSW in 2014 from Tarleton State University and her MSW from Texas A&M University Commerce in 2017. She achieved her LCSW licensure in 2021 and has every intention of working to better client lives and educate the community in order to give back to the profession that has given her so much. Thank you for joining us today, Shannon.
Forgot to unmute. I thought we left that back in 2020. Okay. So can everyone see this okay?
We're seeing you right now. Are you trying to share a
Okay.
presentation?
Yes, hang on.
Okay,
Sorry about that.
no worries.
Okay, is that better?
Yep, we're good. Thank you.
All right. Thank you guys so much for joining me. We're going to be talking this morning a little bit about what dysregulation looks like and kind of taking some of those developmental challenges sometimes that kiddos and adults face that could cause some challenges with emotional regulation. Um, First, let's kind of talk about who experiences emotional dysregulation. I kind of summed it up whenever I said everyone does. Like this morning, even though we're virtual, like I'm noticing like I'm feeling a little bit nervous knowing that so many people have tuned in and are so interested in learning. I'm hoping that I like do a great job for you guys this morning. Um, But just to kind of focus on like, yes, everyone experiences emotional dysregulation, but more specifically, we'll be talking today about kiddos, teens, and adults, like what this looks like, and considerations for us to take in, just as we're kind of moving through our practice, like in mental health and our work in the community. So, what is emotional dysregulation? So, it's not a disorder in and of itself. It's something, like I said, everyone experiences. It's a symptom. It could be tied to a specific diagnosis or situation. It's going to be a pattern of behaviors. Some are more notable than others. And how someone acts, what they say, involves challenges in coping with emotions and how we act on those emotions. I saw in the chat, there's lots and lots of people joining us today with CASA, like working with schools, some people from Cook Children. So, obviously, like in all these different scenarios, like we are put there in place to be able to meet a lot of different kiddos with a lot of different diagnoses where they're at. And hoping to help better their lives and give them the skills that they need to go out into the world and live the life that we would hope for them. What does it look like? So all ages and abilities like may respond differently to different stressors. Some people have, bigger, like more outward behaviors, like some people are more internal processors. And so learning to like identify like the population that we're working with, like what to expect, what to look for, is going to be really crucial in how we show up, how we respond to that. Um, but there may be similarities kind of across the board. There may be certain things that we expect to see among elementary age kiddos. My son's in kindergarten right now. And so some of the things that I hear when he comes home, I'm like, these are things that I expect to hear in a kindergarten classroom. But I work with kids of all ages. So I think my youngest right now is 3.5. And my oldest is, well, I mean, I work with the elderly also in private practice. And there's going to be situations that we all share that are going to bring up some really big things for us, with some of the last few years included. And we'll kind of get more into that the further we get in the presentation. But so let's kind of talk about emotional dysregulation with children. Tantrums, like anybody working with kiddos, like sometimes I know here in our play therapy rooms, whenever it's time to go, maybe we had a really great session together. But that's going to look like I'm not ready to go. I don't want our time to be over together. And so sometimes that dysregulation is just the end of a good thing and not necessarily the presence of some bad things. Low tolerance for frustration. If anyone here has ever been, grocery shopping, we have all seen like that kiddo there in the store who is just tired, they're ready to go home, and they're not having a good time. Emotional outbursts. Sometimes that can look like kiddos who hold like all of that frustration in, and sometimes they just can't hold it in any longer, and they're really like in need of some co-regulation at that point. Aggression with others, or objects. So sometimes that could look like overstimulation, maybe in a classroom. It's noisy, like plans have changed. And kids are not always sure, they don't always have the skills necessary to be able to like roll with the punches like we would as adults some of the time. Refusal or inability to follow school rules or activities. Sometimes we have those kiddos that we come into contact with. I mean, we all need structure, like we all need some predictability. But some kids, like due to different protective factors, have the ability to kind of roll with that a little bit better. Um, the refusal to, when we think about it, children really don't always in their day-to-day lives like have a lot of choice, like especially when it comes to school. There's rules that we have to follow, there's expectations that we have to maintain. And so sometimes that looks like the only choice I have is to say no. Um, and when we're talking about emotional dysregulation, and we will talk more about like what some like diagnoses related to severe dysregulation look like, um, but just like noticing this with kiddos, like it's a pattern of behavior, like learning to develop some interventions, which I think Wendy is going to talk more about this afternoon. Frequent crying. Crying is really relieving to us. Like, it stimulates like a sense of calm. It brings usually like safe adults around us in whenever they're noticing that we're struggling in that way. And so sometimes like kiddos really just like become overwhelmed in that way that like crying is just like what makes the most sense to them at that moment. frequent negative moods or feelings of discouragement. I feel like I see that a lot. I do a lot of trauma work here at the center, obviously, like child advocacy centers, and people who kind of work in that field. We're seeing lots of trauma symptoms. And so um, kids will come in, they're already knowing that they're coming to see me to talk about hard things. And that can feel really discouraging for kids. They're like, I already have to do this hard thing on top of knowing how to make friends, knowing how to follow rules at school, like needing to sit still, like all of those necessary things that we know that kids need to learn to do and kind of work through. And it's just kind of one more added stress for them. And so sometimes they're just really grumpy. Thoughts or verbal statements regarding self-harm. That is something that I've noticed a lot more in recent years. Kids as young as like 4 or 5 saying like, I just want to die. I want to kill myself. And so usually with like some information and some affect identification, like giving kids like the ability to like name those feelings, we can kind of move away from some of those thoughts. Like after we do some safety planning with them, hey, like, do you know what that means? Is that what you meant to say? Or are you just so overwhelmed that just seemed like it made the most sense to you at that time? So, and these are just a few things. Like we have some kiddos who might withdraw like from the group, like they're super overwhelmed. They kind of go into that freeze response and they're really just not able to kind of interact and engage with those around them. Um, some children, just kind of depending on development, may have elopement type behaviors where they're so overwhelmed, like being right there in that situation that they want to run, leave that area, leave that situation. Um, and we do, we have to kind of look at like the population that we're working with and just being aware of like the different diagnoses, like if there are some that are coming with kiddos that we're working with, or if maybe we need to have a conversation with parents about like, hey, let's talk about like what this like could look like. Is there a resource that we can help like to identify and refer them to if further evaluation is needed? And we all know, kids grow up to be teenagers, and, I work with a lot of teens, and those questions usually coming from parents are, "Is this ever going to end?" Like, am I ever gonna feel like I know, who my child is, like, outside of, like, this just really bad mood and grumpy behavior? But emotional dysregulation in teens, excessive crying that lasts longer or is more intense than the situation warrants. I think we need to be careful in these moments, labeling something like an overreaction, being dramatic, because while as adults, like we have that fully developed prefrontal cortex and hopefully really good coping skills on board, um, it feels really real for them, like that is their reality, and so being invested, like wanting to, like, engage with them about, "Hey, this seems so upsetting to you, and I want to know more about that." Um, Anger that is excessive and doesn't really seem justified, we've been seeing that a lot more lately too, just because I feel like, kiddos now have so much more access to each other. I mean, as a millennial, I don't know kind of like what every group that we have here in the presentation today is, but when a lot of us were kids, like when we had summer break or went home for the weekend, sometimes things could kind of die down, and we're not seeing that anymore. So I do see like a lot of anger with kiddos that are coming in, just with situations that can't seem to die down because there's not enough time and space. Withdrawal from family or friends. If anybody in here works with teens, I know you've probably heard from parents, they're in their room all the time, they have the door closed, they don't want to hang out with us. And we know some of this can be normal behavior. We know that teens are wanting to figure out who I am as a person, like how do I fit into the larger world around me, and like how do I want to present that? Um, so just like that emotional dysregulation, kind of the withdrawal piece of that too. I wanted to make sure I include that. Physical aggression towards self or others. I recently did a presentation about non-suicidal self-injury. Um, and that can look like that. It could be punching, it could be, slamming their head, it could be throwing different things. So physical aggression could be throwing objects like, punching, hitting walls, different things like that. Just like this excess of energy that kids aren't really sure what to do with. And so it comes outward. Um, Periods of impulsive behavior, which lead to harmful risk taking. Um, we have working with kids, sometimes have those moments where we're like, what in the world were they thinking? But the truth is, like, maybe they weren't really thinking about it. It just like it was a 1 second thought that just turned into action really quickly. Because what we do know is kids have a super active amygdala, especially like working with kiddos here at the center who are experiencing trauma. Um, that amygdala is activated. That alarm system is going off all the time. Like we're looking for threats to safety. And so having that really active amygdala, having a still developing prefrontal cortex, we're going to have really big feelings, and those feelings are going to shoot through our brain faster than the ability to think and to reason and to process. And that sometimes can create like a really dangerous mixture for kids who are really like not feeling super stable in their emotions, and maybe looking for support in lots of different directions. Some of them good, some of them like maybe not as ideal. Um, Rapid fluctuation between emotional states, super happy, then super depressed. Um, I have a lot of parents who call me and they say, I think my child has bipolar disorder. This morning they were in a really good mood at breakfast, and like now they're very upset. And so it's a lot of psychoeducation with parents. Um, we know that feelings, like emotions, last around 90 seconds in the brain, and it depends on like how much we're feeding those feelings. But it's really hard when are working with kiddos who every moment is that moment, and those moments feel like they last forever. And so we have these situations where, okay, this is super really like it's just wonderful and super intense, and then like that feeling fades, and so they kind of remain like chasing like that really positive feeling, and if they can't achieve that, it does feel like pretty depleting. Suicidal ideation or self-harm, it is super important, I think, to be talking with parents about asking their children if they are feeling suicidal. Um, I probably talk with 2 or 3 people a week about the fact that asking a child if they're feeling suicidal does not increase the risk for suicidality. It does increase the ability for them to be able to ask for help and to make that outcry if they need to. So that way we can achieve safety for them, like make sure they have the services that they need. And self-harm as well. If we notice self-harm, I also do a lot of psychoeducation with parents or grandparents, because we know we have a lot of grandparents raising kiddos now. That self-harm is not necessarily just attention-seeking behavior, and if it is, that's still a really important conversation to have, because for that to be a child's first way to reach out and say like, "Hey, I'm needing some help," it's still a really big deal. High levels of anxiety or worry. Sometimes, like, we will see this in a lot of our kids who really score high academically. They want to make sure they're maintaining a certain GPA so they can make sure I'm getting into this school, I'm getting this scholarship. Um, and also just like paying attention to the things that are happening in the world. It can be really easy for us to believe that kids don't know or understand all of the different events happening and like the ramifications that that has for the future. Um, but they are watching and like they do know. So just checking in with kids saying, "Hey, like I wonder like what are your thoughts on like things happening in the world and what do you know about those things?" Emotional dysregulation as adults. Mandy emailed me earlier in the week and said, we have 350 people registered for training today. And I love speaking, I love educating, and that number, I was like, "Oh my gosh, like, that's a lot of people," and I cannot see all of you, but, like, I feel that you're there. I saw in the chat, lots of people checking in, so I'm grateful that you're here, and also, like, whew, noticed a little bit of dysregulation in myself. Um, but these are just a few examples, so I don't want anyone to think that these lists are exhaustive. But depression and anxiety, I talk with a lot of adults who kind of feel like depression and anxiety are just a normal part of being an adult. They say, I guess everyone feels this way. Um, I think that has a lot to do with like how we currently have community support set up for adults, like people who are parenting, um, people who maybe have a hard time connecting with others. Um, that it just looks a lot of different ways. Feelings of shame and anger. So what we know is when children experience things, children or teenagers, and they grow up to be adults, like if we were not able to like assess those experiences for them or like apply aid, like whether that be counseling, medication, hospitalization for them in some instances, We know that those things don't go away. Sometimes, like as parents, parents or caregivers, like we can feel a lot of guilt or shame if we're not able to spend, like the Instagram perfect amount of time, like making our kids lunch, like spending all the time that we would like to with them because we're doing everything we can to make sure our household stays running, are functioning to the best of our ability. Self-harming, I feel like that topic, like, doesn't necessarily come up so much with adults, at least kind of in the area that I'm working in. I'm in a more rural area. Um, but I, am still, like, pretty consistently surprised, when there is a conversation about self-harm among adults. It can look a lot of different ways. I know a lot of people think, self-harm is, cutting, burning, um, hitting, like, different things like that, but it can look like, alcohol misuse. It can look like overeating. It can look like, just behaviors that are more risky for adults to engage in, that in some ways are socially acceptable, and so if we notice a friend is kind of changing behaviors in that way, just making sure that we're checking in and saying, "Hey, I'm noticing, like, a different pattern of behavior for you, like, is everything okay?" Excessive substance use, high risk sexual behaviors. Um, I do a lot of talking with parents about just the importance of, like, making sure, trauma is addressed, like, early for children, because I know in working with people that sometimes, like, sexual abuse can turn into, like, more, sexualized behavior, like, just in an attempt to regain some of that power and control. Um, but that also is, like, self-harming behavior in a lot of ways. Extreme perfectionism, kind of going back to, like, we have so much pressure from social media to, um, send the dinosaur-shaped sandwich, like, in our lunchbox and, like, have, like, the really cute, like, toothpicks that go with them, having, like, a perfectly curated home, like, a new car, like, all of these things, and so I feel like I meet a lot of adults who are really struggling with the perceived idea of what things should look like, and that can really cause a lot of emotional dysregulation in day-to-day life because our thoughts can be consumed by that. Highly conflictual interpersonal relationships. Um, we all and maybe know somebody, who really struggles in interpersonal relationships. It's really hard to have a conversation with them without, like, offense or, like, anger kind of coming out in that way. But just recognizing, like, that is emotional dysregulation and something is causing that. That's coming from somewhere. Nobody ever wakes up in the morning and says, "I wanna fight with everyone I know who is doing well." Um, disordered eating, kind of again going back to, like, a lot of I mean, remember in, like, the '90s, 2000s, you couldn't hardly go to the grocery store without seeing, magazines about how to, like, alter, body type, like weight, things like that. But also knowing, like, that is, in some ways, like, how people regain power and control over themselves, perceived anyway. And then suicidal thoughts or attempts. I think, again, like, super important to address. It can be a little bit tricky sometimes, like, working with adults with suicidal ideation, like, in doing, therapy, things like that, because we may be a little bit restricted in, like, what we're able to, report or request that they do, just because adults have a little more autonomy, than teens or kids do. We can talk with a parent about, "Hey, I really think, like, hospitalization, like, would be beneficial and appropriate in this case," versus with an adult. It can be a pretty scary thing, I think, for providers, and I do wanna talk a little bit about that, just in the work that we're doing. So when is dysregulation likely? So if we have the presence of current or past trauma triggers, or threat or fear of future trauma, if we're anticipating something really not great is going to be coming our way, it's really hard to regulate ourselves and kind of remain present in our body. Unexpected or stressful situations. I've never met, I'm not going to say never. It is not usual for me to meet somebody who loves the unexpected. When stress pops up, they thrive in that. Um, I do meet some of those people, and I admire that in a lot of ways because I am not always so great with that. Um, so it could like the stressful situation, like this could be unique to the individual. Maybe we have a kiddo who works really well at the last minute. Anybody working in schools, You've probably met a kiddo who's like, "No, I do really well if I can wait till the night before to do my spelling homework," whatever that looks like. Um, and sometimes, like, that can look like, in elementary age kids, it's raining and we're not going to recess. Well, that's gonna cause kind of an unexpected or maybe stressful situation among maybe that entire school because now we're doing inside recess, and that's not anticipated, not what kids were hoping for, and so we can see a lot of dysregulation at that time. When there are differences in brain development or functioning, I'll kinda get more into that here in just a minute. Um, the presence of mental health conditions that usually involve, disruptions in mood, personality, and ability to regulate self. Um, if we have something different about our brain or our body, it's gonna impact, like, the way that we are taught to, like, receive, like, education about coping skills and, like, the way, we are experiencing the structure that's set up for, like, what we're expected to do. And so knowing that just being aware of, like, those different mental health diagnoses, and educating ourselves about, like, how do I meet this child where they are. Damage to the brain structure, it could be, brain damage from birth, an illness diagnosis, accident or abuse. Just being aware that sometimes like we have to adjust our expectations. If somebody is coming to us with something that is like not repairable, like just being aware if someone has maybe a traumatic brain injury, a TBI, um, they may be aware and doing all that they can to kind of adjust and kind of keep moving with that, and, like, we just have to be aware on our ends that, like, maybe we have to, like, alter the plans a little bit to allow for maybe some dysregulation or reduce it where we're able to. Um, Maybe basic needs are not being met. Um, we know Maslow's hierarchy. If we don't have food, clothing, shelter, we're not gonna be able to do some of those bigger things. And I know I saw some people, like, working in, like, CASA communities and schools. Um, and you'll know if we're meeting somebody who is not having those basic needs met, asking them to sit and listen and learn, whether that's children, teens, or adults, like asking them to come in and like do a really great job at work. Sometimes those things are just not going to be possible because we're not in a situation where it's easy to regulate. Sorry, guys. Developmental considerations. So with childhood trauma, we know, or I mean, I know especially like in the work that I'm doing right now, sometimes when we have kids come in, like there may be some age regression. If there is something that is kind of triggering to a child, I may expect to see younger behavior from them. Or if there is a trigger that comes up, I may expect to see really different behavior than maybe how they had initially presented, like in the lobby, having different conversation with things. And if I am seeing that in session, I can only imagine how much of that is going to be happening maybe during a school day, during an outing where lots of different things that could come up that they just don't have the developmental skills to be able to handle yet. Neurodivergent diagnoses. This conversation has really taken off in the last few years. We are more aware now that ADHD, autism, like just all of, like, the or sometimes, like, a dual combination, of both of those diagnoses, and just all of the really beautiful things that, neurodivergent people can kind of bring to conversation, um, but just kind of being aware that maybe the way one person interprets information is gonna be different than how someone else interprets it, and having, like, good open dialogue with either caregivers or, the individual themselves about, "Hey, I'm putting this together, are there any considerations that we can make regarding that?" I know Cook Children's, like, does a really great job of asking, like, are any accommodations needed when it comes to making presentations, knowing that not everyone is gonna receive information or engage with information in that same way. Um, Children and adolescents with developmental delays are likely to have trouble coping with frustration and challenging changes in environment than their peers, and that could be like speech. Like, so my son has been in speech for the last 3 years, and that has been a big learning curve. Having been a therapist his whole life, I thought, okay, we can just learn some coping skills, um, we'll practice these things, like, we'll just kind of stay consistent with it. And something that I've noticed with him is, like, as his speech, like, has progressed, he's able to share a little bit more information, and I was totally wrong about some of the things I thought he was struggling with because I was doing a lot of guesswork. So that can look like just being aware and being ready for like changes. If we're trying a coping skill and it doesn't seem to be working, it may not be that that's the right coping skill for them. And we just have to stay prepared to pivot, if we need to. Fit changes in physical development. So just and that can look like, here at the center, an activity that we have for a child who maybe uses mobility equipment may look really different. We may have to modify that in some ways because for us to just expect that everyone coming into the center has the same level of ability, um, it's really not gonna be conducive, and I know people, understandably so, are gonna be really frustrated if they're not able to engage in those same activities, um, and it that's gonna cause some emotional dysregulation, and cognitive delays. Just being, like, aware of maybe, like, the age of development that someone is functioning from, rather than just using, um, a visual cue to know, like, "Oh, this person, physically, like, appears to be an adult, so I must just go forward with that assumption." Um, just being aware of these changes, like these differences and some of these diagnoses that can be out there and being willing to be open to having those conversations, being willing to be open about knowing what you don't know. So that way you can pivot, kind of make some changes and decrease the likelihood that there could be a bigger show of emotional dysregulation. I have a couple things in here. I'm not going to get too into them because I know I can get really close to time. And Wendy's going to be talking about this a little bit. So I'll just go through them briefly. Just if you are aware that STAR testing is coming up, I know that's huge. Or if you were aware that like a friend has a really big certification test coming up, I saw that there were some like LMSWs, like some people who were still going through their licensing hours. Just being aware of how stressful that can be for friends, loved ones, like coworkers, and helping to kind of address some of that stress, I think is hugely helpful in building relationship, building community, um, creating a timeline with kiddos. So we will sometimes have a kiddo who's super not ready to leave the playroom when it's time to go. And that can look like the next time we meet saying, "Hey, I don't think I gave you enough notice. Like whenever I said we had 5 minutes left, I saw that that really bothered you. I wonder, would it be really helpful if I gave you 10 minutes next time?" Something I really like doing with my like junior high, high school aged kids is creating a sun scale and kind of applying, like looking back at this timeline of, okay, so we were at a 3 in the morning when we got to school, and by 1 o'clock, like, right after lunch, we were at a 9. So tell me, like, what happened in there? How did we go from a 3 to a 9? Like, where could we have built in some coping skills? Like, what could we have done to help? So involving them and identifying those feelings, and how the dysregulation escalated. Knowing sometimes we may have to offer a safe and comfortable space many, many times before we're able to form a connection with someone that they need to be able to lean into us. Um, letting, kids or adults, like I didn't say it's just one or the other, because sometimes adults have to know that they can truly trust another person before they're able to be like, "Hey, I'm really struggling with these things and I need some help." Um, Practicing identifying emotions, practicing coping skills that the child is likely or willing to follow through with, just to help kind of offset the next dysregulating event. I think that's important to do. And the reason I emphasize likely or willing to follow through with, I had so many kiddos come in the last few years where I'll say, "So tell me, like, what do you know about coping skills?" And they say, "If you ask me to talk to 10, I'm not going to, or count to 10, I'm not going to do that. That does not help me." Good information to know. I was gonna suggest that. But just knowing like, okay, like, so tell me like what does work for you? Um, to try to get into like, how does your mind work? Like, how do you find yourself like de-escalating? Okay. When possible, like making discussion regarding feelings fun. Sometimes like we can kind of focus on when things don't go well, kind of doing that timeline back to like when did that dysregulation happen? We can normalize regulation, like regulating talk about like both happy and frustrating events that kids are having. Man, I noticed that you experienced like so much joy today. Like you looked so happy. Like, tell me what that felt like for you. Um, This one can be really tricky, especially if we have kids who escalate verbally. Speaking in a calm, steady tone of voice, redirecting a child, or sometimes adults, like I shouldn't have just written child, to a quieter, calmer area. We know that adults also like have a lot going on. And so sometimes if we're working with a client who really feels like someone's not hearing them, the volume may go up and up. We may need to say, hey, like I see you and I recognize the experience that you're having. Like, can we go talk over here? Modeling good regulatory skills ourselves. It's really tricky. Um, we all have a bad time, like every now and then, like we all have kind of grumpy moods, like we all can kind of struggle in that way. So if you notice that someone around you is like having a hard time inviting other people into our sense of calm, um, and creating that for ourselves in the ways that we're able to. Um, assessing whether needs are being met. And I said child, but child or adult. And setting appropriate boundaries for the situation. We'll kind of get more into that in my next presentation. But acknowledging the emotion being presented, staying curious, staying present, as long as it's a safe situation. If we feel like our safety is in danger, like we are absolutely within our right to say, okay, I'm here with you and I'm going to bring someone or people in to help us with this. Okay. So I know I ended just a couple minutes early, but I was really afraid of going over. Does anyone, hang on, let me try to do this. Does anyone have any questions?
Think I just unmuted Trudy if she wants to ask her question, and then Peggy, I'll unmute you afterwards.
I guess my question is, having grandchildren and having had a couple boys, most of it seems like sort of normal behavior, if you will, until you get to the extreme of self-harm. I mean, kids have tantrums, and I guess my question is, will somebody help us kind of understand where is that line where intervention becomes incredibly important and necessary?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And I think in large part with that, it's going to look like how long is this pattern of behavior going on for? If we are looking at like this is going on for like weeks or months at a time, and it's not kind of just it's not around like a certain event, it's not around like a certain time of year, maybe that's just more difficult for someone. When it becomes like a regular pattern of behavior and like normal interventions, like meeting them where they're at, saying like, "Hey, like, kind of tell me like what's going on for you." If we're noticing like that just continues, I think that would be a great time to kind of seek assessment, evaluation, talking with your doctor about like, "Hey, I have some concerns about this behavior." So if behaviors continue to escalate and we're not really able to like find a source for that and it just continues, like that is when I would say we definitely need to be like talking with some professionals at that time.
Okay. Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you.
We did have a couple questions in the chat. One is I've seen kids refuse any coping skills when super escalated. Any advice there?
Yeah, I think at that point, something that we always do with kiddos here at the center, polyvagal theory, if we're up in the red, like if we are at a 10 out of 10, introducing coping skills at that time, like may not be the most effective. That may mean that we need to kind of give it a little bit of time. Like I know in schools, there can be like a de-escalation room sometimes that kids go into just to kind of help them calm down a little bit. Um, so, um, with something like that, I would just say kind of being present with them. If that means like still kind of keeping some space if you're like in the next room, if they need to just kind of sit or be in a separate space for a minute while they can kind of calm down. I'm not sure exactly what kind of situation you were maybe thinking of when you asked, but if that means we have a teen who's really not even capable of having a conversation at that point, saying, "Hey, why don't we take a 20 or 30-minute break so they know it's planned that we will come back to them, like come back to the conversation. Hey, in 30 minutes, like let's reconvene on this, and let's talk about it if you're feeling like you're at a place at that time that we can have that conversation." So even just acknowledging, hey, now's not the best time.
Okay, thanks, Shannon. We had another one. So, approximately how long does it take to help a child or teen learn healthy coping skills that they can begin to implement on their own when stressful situations occur?
Um, that really can depend on the kiddo. We've had kids come in and I've been able to introduce some coping skills, and they're really able to pick them up and start using them within a few weeks. I've also had some kiddos where, kind of like we were talking about, if someone's at a 10 out of 10, or they're just really up there emotional dysregulation wise, for them to be able to access some of that new information, like they cannot be super, super high up. And so what that may look like is I'm doing a lot of timelines with them, like we're doing a lot of future planning. Hey, so you've got beginning of the year testing coming up, and I know that's super stressful for you. Let's kind of plan like how do we keep that from getting to an 8 so we're more likely to engage with those coping skills like as and while that's happening. So it's a super wide range. Like I hate to give a vague answer to that question, but it could be a few weeks and it could be like a few months of working with kids, giving them those reminders and also sometimes modeling that behavior for them, just kind of depending on how old they are. Man, I notice I'm feeling really fill in the blank. I'm going to go on a short walk. Do you want to come with me? Or I'm going to turn the TV off and just kind of sit in the quiet for a little while. Like, do you want to sit with me? So just having them see us engaging in those behaviors, like is more conducive to them also engaging in those same behaviors.
Trudy, did you want to ask your question? I think I have you unmuted now.
I already did, thank you.
I see a typed question. I mentioned the 90-second time frame for emotions. How would I recommend we use this information to help children identify and regulate emotions? So depending on how old a child is, with my younger kids, I kind of look at it like we talk a lot about Inside Out. I don't know how many people here have seen that. If you haven't seen it, I need you to watch it. Um, but I kind of look at that like, okay, we're going to be feeding those feelings. So if we have a feeling pop up, we can notice that feeling, we'll acknowledge it. Um, and that, sorry. Okay. But with that, so we can just tell kids, hey, like we can choose some of the time to, if we have a feeling pop up or we notice that like something is, we're starting to ruminate, it's really starting to bother us. Um, we can look at, are we feeding that feeling? Are we feeding that feeling thoughts that are making that feeling bigger and bigger? Because a lot of kids really get a good visualization out of that. Um, and they're like, oh, and I'll ask them like, are we feeding our feeling? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, okay, so let's do something else. And sometimes even distracting ourselves from rumination for, 2 minutes can be enough to help us break that rumination cycle and kind of get us on a better track for that. And to kind of answer the rest of that question, identifying feelings. And sometimes that looks like us modeling, man, I am so happy that the weather's going to be so nice next week. Man, I am so sad that it rained and your soccer game was canceled. I am, just kind of like naming those feelings like in age appropriate ways. And then talking about like, how are we going to cope with that feeling? Like, what are we going to do with that feeling? So really a lot of like modeling those behaviors and then turning that back around. Like if you notice that your child is doing something like, man, I see you stomping your feet and I see like your frown on your face. Like, I wonder if you're feeling mad right now. So helping them connect like what they're doing with what they're feeling or what you're noticing about them helps them increase that self-awareness.
Awesome. Shannon, I think we had one more question over from the chat. How do sensory sensitivities impact regulation, especially for neurodivergent people? How to integrate into helping regulate along with special interests?
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of really great information with that, with sensory activities. Just getting like a good idea of, because I think we can really lead into like, hey, like tell me some things that really bother you. Um, but I think like having that information is good, but just kind of talking with them about like, hey, like when you're trying to relax, like what are some things, or like when you're happy, like what are some things you notice are going on? Um, because it could be that, um, like I know my son has some classmates that when they do inside recess, like some kiddos like will have like an alternative activity because it gets hot in that gym and like heat is sometimes like really overstimulating to kids. They can get kind of burnt out and grouchy. And so just incorporating like special interests, different things like that. So if we know we have to kind of prepare for an alternative for something, we can also use storyboards. I've done that with my son too. We will look at like, hey, what's this day going to look like? And I may use like special interests. Like we were really big on um, zoo animals for a while. So I'm like, okay, we have these guys, like they're going to be going and doing this at school today, just like you're going to be doing today. So just incorporating like as much as we can, like a special interest with anything that will be sensory friendly, like to the individual person that we're working with. Um, And then if we get something wrong, like just being aware of like, okay, that didn't work out that time and just kind of looking at like kind of doing like an after action review. Was it because that just wasn't appropriate for that situation, or were there multiple things happening like where those two things just did not go well together? So I hope I answered that.
Thank you again, Shannon, for sharing such great information with us. Um, Now you're going to get to continue to share with us on diagnoses associated with severe symptoms of dysregulation. Thanks again.
Alrighty, y'all. So those of you who stuck around for part two, thank y'all so much. Okay, so and kind of like piggybacking off like what we were just talking about, and I'm so glad I think it was Trudy who asked the question about how do we know when symptoms of dysregulation are more serious than just dysregulation. So we're going to be doing some talking about that today. We're going to be talking about oppositional defiant disorder, disruptive mood dysregulation disorder or DMDD, and conduct disorder. So with each of these, at one point, it was kind of a consideration that it'd be like a spectrum of dysregulation, with ODD kind of being at the bottom, with DMDD being in the middle, and then conduct disorder being at the top. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So with each of these diagnoses, it accompanies a noticeable and severe pattern of dysregulation in youth. That's also going to be looking at the time frame that the dysregulation is occurring. There are, among these three different diagnoses, it varies in severity, but there are multiple implications for medical and mental health professionals, school professionals, families, communities, and like youth themselves. Um, how to find like not mastery, but like just making that dysregulation a little more, well, a lot more manageable, because it does have implication legally, like for a lot of kiddos. So as we proceed through the presentation, I just want you guys to be keeping in mind youth that you may know. I think that we all know people in our lives like who could meet some of these criteria for these diagnoses. And I just want you to use this information to further community knowledge and increase supportive measures for individuals like living with any of these diagnoses. I think in a lot of ways, dysregulative disorders have a lot of stigma associated with them because it looks like someone is being difficult. It looks like they just don't want to follow the rules. It looks a lot of different ways. But really, when we're seeing these behaviors, it can be easy to want to pull away from that. But really, we need to be leaning in, because this does not go away on its own. It is so much more than just a bad mood. It is like this child actively living with so much dysregulation, or child, teen, adult, um, that they're having a massive disruption in their lives. And that's why it's labeled a disorder, because it's causing challenges in like multiple aspects of their lives. First, we'll talk a little bit more about oppositional defiant disorder. It's marked by persistent patterns of angry or irritable moods, argumentative or defiant behavior, or vindictive behavior towards others. And I know we're probably all thinking like, oh my gosh, like I know someone like who's experiencing that. Symptoms must be severe and disruptive to activities of daily living for at least 6 months, meeting 4 or more of the DSM-5 criteria. Um, Symptoms are noted typically by the age of 8, as young as 6, though. So symptoms are consistent between the ages of 5 and 10. Something that was interesting to me, because I have met quite a few kiddos who have that diagnosis. There were other things going on. Um, Symptoms may but will not always decline like after the age of 10. Um, that was super interesting to me because I feel like I'm having kids come to me who are receiving that diagnosis, who kind of like don't fit that age range. It's estimated to affect between 2 and 11% of children. The reason that that percentage is so wide is like there's sometimes like some misdiagnosis that go on, and like an underdiagnosis of teenagers. Sometimes like we can assume that behavior is just normal. It's a teen being a teen, and it's really easy. I think, well, not easy. Um, People can kind of like disregard like teenage behavior as just being teenage behavior. Um, Oppositional defiant disorder is more typically diagnosed in males than females when younger, but as kids get to be teenagers, the rates are pretty equal. In terms of like the, genetic, biological, and environmental factors, something that was super interesting to me just in kind of looking a little further into this is that research suggests that genetics can account for up to 50% in the development of oppositional defiant disorder. So there is like a big genetic and biological component to that. Um, there is oftentimes a lot of comorbidities with oppositional defiant disorder. Um, Whenever I've had children come into the center to be treated, if we're seeing like some of these types of behaviors, my first question is always, what came first, the behavior or the trauma? So I want to be looking at, is this a manifestation of something else? And it does happen to meet the DSM-5 criteria, or like, is there some other factors at play here? We don't diagnose here at the center, but it is something that I just remain curious about. Some of the biological factors, some studies suggest that there's certain areas of the brain that play a bigger part in oppositional defiant disorder, um, with there being like an imbalance in like some of the neurotransmitters. So, um, definitely like that the biological piece to that is there a predisposition to it? And it looks like in large part that there is. And environmental factors. We know that with a lot of different diagnoses, especially ones that have like more components of dysregulation, the environment that someone's in like could like flip the switches for some of those factors that lead to a diagnosis, that lead to a physical manifestation of that behavior. Um, that can look like a really chaotic home life, maltreatments, inconsistent parenting, that kind of like lead the child to wonder, like, what am I supposed to be doing? And if I don't have a consistent way to achieve like the attention of my parent, what do I need to do to be able to do that? Um, in addition to that, like, and again, like what I'm seeing a lot of up here, some of the well, I see a lot of it in like spurts, like in different groups. Peer rejection, hanging out with friends who are maybe engaging in behaviors that are not super safe, like socioeconomic status, having our needs met, because we know that kids who may be just reacting to the behavior or to the environment that they're in could meet criteria in that way. Witness to violence, and just other like just unstable factors like in their environment are going to lead to a situation like where maybe some of these behaviors are coming up more often. Um, Treatment, something else that I found super interesting is across these three, treatment is going to look pretty similar. Conduct disorder has some different implications, but it's going to look like working a lot with parents, doing a lot of, depending on the age of the child, maybe doing parent-child interaction therapy, um, There's also another training that I had not heard a lot about. It's called parent management training. It's for parents of children ages 2 to 17, um, that just kind of talks about and really focuses on how do parents like interact with the behavior, and just working really like on consistency. Um, in the area that I live in, like, Hood County area, we don't always have the resources for a lot of these things. And so something that I found to be, kind of challenging looking at all the data and the research, um, is how to engage parents and caregivers. Like, what does that look like to have like a parent like follow through with something, and also having like providers in the area who like can provide that service. Um, Different therapies, cognitive behavioral therapy, just kind of helping like kids to identify um, the thoughts that they're thinking, like how that affects behavior, how that affects emotion, and dialectical behavioral therapy, really focusing on some of the emotional modification of that. How are we processing through these feelings, like in a way that keeps us like from kind of like boiling over. Um, and then school-based interventions. Something, and I was talking with a colleague of mine who worked in the schools for a long time, is it can be really challenging to receive accommodations, at least like in the area that I'm in, that I'm aware of, um, for diagnoses like this. Because it's like, as far as like meeting criteria for like special education, um, because we like there's the kind of hope that like response to intervention like may help to like address some of these behaviors instead of like having to engage in like specialized services. So that was a conversation that we had, like just kind of like an anecdote to everything else that I looked through. Um, but we're seeing a lot of kids with behavior issues in schools, and I think something we're noticing is just a gap in like how are we able to address that in a way that parents will engage, that children will engage, and that things will continue to get better for these families. So disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, also kind of a mouthful, DMDD, originated as a diagnosis in the DSM-5 in 2013. Um, I was not even in grad school yet, and so that was news to me. Like I didn't realize that that was just such a recent diagnosis. We're only in 2024. Um, but on that same note, like I have had a lot of kiddos who, if they reach a stage of like needing hospitalization, here at the center, when we receive discharge paperwork after their hospitalization, we are noticing like that is a more common diagnosis that kids are receiving. It is marked by severe temper outbursts 3 or more times per week, so it is more severe in that way than oppositional defiant disorder. Outbursts or tantrums happening regularly for at least 12 months. So where ODD was at least 6 months, DMDD is at least 12. Chronically irritable or angry moods most of each day, trouble functioning due to irritability in more than one place, so home, school, or with peers. Um, what we're seeing is it's more than just someone kind of being grumpy. It is just somebody who, is kind of like I've mentioned before, those adults that we meet, like where everything is just like nothing is great. Like people are waking up seemingly like they're just ready to argue with anyone they come into contact with throughout the day. Um, it's commonly diagnosed between the ages of 6 and 10. Symptoms must be experienced regularly for at least 12 or more months and able to receive that diagnosis. It's estimated that between 2 and 5% of children meet DMDD criteria. Um, the diagnosis is not provided in children under the age of 6 or adolescents over the age of 18. So this is not a diagnosis that an adult would receive. There is still information like being looked into as far as like what exactly um, is like the cause of DMDD. Obviously, there are going to be biological, genetic, and environmental factors. 1 second. Okay, sorry. Treatment is going to look pretty similar as far as therapy. Sometimes like family therapy to help like with some of the dynamics at home that could be more or less dysregulating. Some medications, there is a lot of comorbidity with this, and that could look like ADHD, just kind of exacerbating like all of this. Um, doing a lot of parent education and a lot of parent support because I mean, if we're looking at this looks like temper outbursts 3 or more times a week, outbursts or tantrums regularly for 12 months, chronically irritating or irritable behavior, and just trouble functioning like socially at home, at school, really doing a lot of parent education and support, school accommodations, like an evaluation for comorbidities. And the reason we want to do that evaluation for comorbidity um, is just to eliminate like any possible diagnosis that we're missing. If we're dealing with dysregulation on the one front, just like from ADHD alone, which is untreated, we're going to be looking at depression. We're going to be looking at anxiety, increasing the likelihood of like substance misuse. So we're wanting to like address that sooner rather than later, so that doesn't escalate any further. With the therapies kind of looking the same with cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy. Um, and I think again, like one of the trickiest aspects whenever I think of like the area that I'm in, is engaging parents. Sometimes like if we've had like behaviors like going on for this long and that it warrants this diagnosis, um, parents I feel like can really not pull away from, but parents can really kind of get caught up in the behaviors and feel like, well, nothing I'm doing is working. And I do not want to keep trying this. Especially like the closer we get to like mid-adolescence, like those middle teenage years. Um, we hear that a lot at the center. I'm done trying to tell them like not to act that way. And then we have a lot of parents who are sometimes single parents, um, grandparents, other types of caregivers, who may just like really have a hard time with that patience aspect of things. Maybe they're working more than one job, like maybe they've like really had a lot of financial hardship, like missing work due to child getting in trouble at school, the need for hospitalization. And there are some instances where kids become involved in the juvenile justice system, due to like engaging in more risky behavior, hanging out with people who are also engaging in like some really dysregulated behavior. Um, and so just kind of looking at like the overall challenges with this, like it is so much more than just like disruptive mood. It is like how this person is moving through the world and like all of the different things that that touches. Um, I think is really cause for like a lot of complicating issues. Okay, so conduct disorder. Um, I don't know how many people in here have heard of conduct disorder. It's definitely something that I've heard of before. We have not had a lot of kiddos come through the center with this diagnosis. Um, or I think we've had a couple, but typically like the end result of conversation, like with their larger treatment team, was placement in a residential treatment center, for like long going, like more intensive support. So conduct disorder is going to be marked by pervasive and repetitive pattern of behavior that looks like aggression towards people, animals, destruction of property, and a violation of the rules. Um, conduct disorder is severe. Um, and just talking about like DMDD. So, I mean, that in and of itself, like, a behavior that is so dysregulating for an entire year. Conduct disorder is kind of its um, much rougher older sibling, I guess, if we want to kind of look at it like that. I have some notes here. Oh, sorry. Okay. So in just kind of looking at this, so cruelty or aggression towards people or animals like is in and of itself concerning enough. Um, because when in hearing things like that, it can be really difficult to know exactly how to treat that. Like, who do we tell that to? Because that's just really like an abnormal set of behavior that we're not used to seeing in like a general population we might be working with. Destruction of property, a violation of the rules. Um, those two things like we can sometimes like see in school with like symptoms of dysregulation that can look like, throwing things like in a classroom, like breaking things. But this is on a separate level from that. Some of like the aggressive behavior can look like bullying, physical violence. Sometimes that can include a weapon, verbal fights, threatening. Sometimes like what we may hear up at the center is for sexual activity. So it could be sexual assault of another person, having to do with power and control over someone else. Um, hurting animals, there is sometimes like difficulty in accepting responsibility for like their behavior. Um, and this could look like intentionally setting fire. So, sometimes we'll and just like asking, like in some of the screening that we do is, has there been, any cruelty to animals, fire starting, different things like that, just so we kind of know, like, how do we do some safety planning with this? Um, Signs of deceit, lying, stealing could include stealing from people or businesses. So again, there's going to be like that factor of involvement with like the justice system at that point. Um, not going to school. Like we get a lot of phone calls like here at the center about that, like how to help kids like be motivated to go to school. And I will have conversations about people who are with people who are calling, just saying, well, how long has this been going on for? Is there other accompanying behavior with that? Um, this can also look like, substance misuse. Obviously, we have a lot of dysregulation happening if the behaviors have escalated to such a severe point at this time. It could be alcohol or substance use. It could be engaging in like high risk sexual behaviors, even at a young age. Um, there is like child onset, so onset before the ages of 10. I've received like phone calls where someone will say, we're waiting to get into a residential treatment center. Is there any way you could treat them? Like, here's like the list of problems that we're having. And we always want to just really carefully like brainstorm on this, make sure that this child has like as much resource, wraparound support as possible. Just obviously like becoming easily frustrated. Something a little bit different about conduct disorder is sometimes, we've had kids come in with ODD or DMDD, we're able to kind of look back and like have a discussion about like, hey, so tell me like how did this start to escalate for you? And we can do like some of like that timeline kind of stuff I talked about in my first presentation. But sometimes with conduct disorder, that can also look like not trying to hide that aggressive behavior, like using that to cause other people to be fearful. Um, there may be like a lack of remorse, like for some of these behaviors. Um, Obviously, like difficulty, like making and maintaining friendships. Sometimes these friendships could be like dual purpose serving, and that maybe this other person is also engaging in these behaviors, and it's something that they engage in together, and that's kind of like the commonality there. Um, so there is no like one certain thing about conduct disorder, but obviously like there is going to be like again the biological genetic. There's also neurological factors I think at play here as well. As far as like genetic or biological, um, typically in children tested, like there are very high testosterone levels. Um, there, could be like some inherited factors here as well. Children diagnosed with conduct disorder are more likely to have a parent like who has also been diagnosed with some type of dysregulation disorder as well. And we know, kind of going back to ODD and DMDD, growing up in like a chaotic environment, like having inconsistent parenting, like is more likely to cause dysregulation in children. But then knowing that parent may also have like an accompanying diagnosis or comorbidity with that is going to increase the likelihood that this child is going to struggle. Um, we also need to take into account, like when it comes to neurological, um, could there be seizures present, causing some damage to the brain? Is there a traumatic brain injury, or some type of like neurological damage that could be leading to some of this aggressive behavior? I know we had kind of talked a little bit in the first presentation about like we need to be aware, are we working with someone who has a traumatic brain injury? It could be damaging to the parts of the brain that are responsible for behavior. Is someone more quick to aggression? So ruling out or identifying like comorbidities or just challenges with like how someone would normally regulate. And as far as like parental, family, and environmental factors, um, some of the comorbidities associated with this, ADHD, mood disorders, schizophrenia, and then typically later in adulthood, this could look like antisocial personality disorder as well. Obviously, a home environment that lacks structure and adequate supervision, with frequent conflicts between child and parent, which if we're seeing behaviors like this, like that's highly likely. So some of these disagreements and things like that are ultimately contributing to like this becoming a bigger problem in the future. Because these are really big things that parents are dealing with. Um, Children exposed to frequent domestic violence are also at a higher risk of being diagnosed or developing conduct disorder. Low socioeconomic status, like lack of access to resources is going to cause like, internal conflict, like challenges, we talked about with Maslow's hierarchy, coping with dysregulation, um, and also just sometimes like with like lower socioeconomic status. The area that I currently live in, we have like a very like wide range of like our county. In our county, like we have like one area like where there's a lot more funds and resources. We also have another area where funds and resources are really limited. And so what we see in these areas, like, and something that we've just noted, is when we have people coming from these two areas, like what we may expect in session could be really, really different. There's a higher likelihood that children in like the lower SES area in our county has drug exposure and has exposure to like domestic violence and a higher crime rate. So just noting that like these are all things that could be threats to safety for like a younger child is conducive to growing up to be diagnosed with conduct disorder. As far as like the lifetime prevalence rates, it's 2 to 10%. It is more common in males than females. So with child onset, problems are going to begin before the age of 10. Adolescent, there's not really as many problems before the age of 10. Like we start to begin to see issues with dysregulation after the age of 10. And then just unspecified, we are not really super sure. Maybe we don't have good family history. Maybe we have parents who are not really able to give us that information, parents or caregivers. So we're just not super sure. So we can't assign like when that would have happened for them. So treatment, we are wanting to make sure we do a good like psychosocial assessment as much as we're able to. We want to make sure that we are evaluating for any kind of comorbidities because we're wanting to treat, like there's not one specific medication for conduct disorder, but if there is substance use disorder, if there is ADHD, if there's depression, anxiety, like anything that could be contributing to like the escalation of some of these behaviors, we're wanting to make sure that they're treating those as well. And also like when it comes to treatment, typically like we will be looking at CBT and DBT. And sometimes like whenever I was reading that, I felt kind of surprised by that. I'm not sure exactly like what I was expecting when it comes to reading about treatment for that. But like these just seem like such big behaviors that as somebody who is not used to treating conduct disorder, it made me really curious, like, and want to like reach out to someone who does to kind of see what does that look like. How are people engaging with like parent support, and just like the success of treatment overall. And kind of like I had mentioned, we've had a couple of kiddos come through the center with that diagnosis, and like ultimately like we're not able to remain in the home. The best long-term treatment for them was going to be a residential treatment center, with like rules, laws, guidelines that they have to follow, just to kind of help provide as much safety and stability for that child as possible, or to get treatment and hopefully learn to kind of work through like such big feelings of dysregulation. So some crossovers and similarities. There is going to be some things like each of these things share in one way or another. Just kind of starting with treatment. I was surprised, but not surprised that like obviously we're going to be looking at different treatment modalities, whether that's medication or mental health that are addressing like the underlying causes of dysregulation. here, whenever we have kiddos come through with DMDD or ODD, like I said, I'm always curious about like what came first, like the behavior, the diagnosis, um, in large part because kids have so little power and control over their situation that if the behavior started really early, it just kind of becomes like a normal pattern for them. Parents may not always feel like they're well equipped to handle that, and they kind of hope kids grow out of it. Well, then we have strengthened the length of time and the way we like lead into like that's just our normal pattern. Um, so with ODD versus DMDD or ODD versus conduct disorder, both of these are primarily going to be focused on conflicts with authority figures. So you may notice that a child with ODD is being told to do something by a teacher, and it's like, no, I'm not doing that. Versus conduct disorder, like that refusal or rejection of that prompt, like may look more severe. It could be as simple as just, disregarding, like just not doing that, or it could be like a pretty big escalation in behavior that could involve threats to safety. Um, ODD behaviors are obviously like much less severe, tend to involve like primarily angry, kind of annoying, argumentative behavior, versus conduct disorder tends to be more severe, typically involving physical aggression, fire starting, animal cruelty. There are a lot of issues with truancy, um, just because like school really is like largely about structure. A lot of kids with conduct disorder may see that as, yeah, I'm gonna go and all they're gonna do is tell me what to do, and I'm just not super interested in that. Um, and typically, like when kids are not in a structured environment, like in school, if someone's not able to have like good access like to that child and is able to provide supervision, like we know that other behaviors are going to escalate. Um, so there are like some correlations. So around like, and this is not like a straight line. Like it's not that someone is diagnosed with ODD and then DMDD and then conduct disorder later. Right around 30% of children who are diagnosed with ODD are then later diagnosed with conduct disorder. Um, but not all individuals with conduct disorder were at some point diagnosed with ODD. That could be lack of access to individuals that could have provided that diagnosis. I'd kind of mentioned like the hope that that situation would just kind of get better on its own. Um, or it could just be that maybe they didn't start to exhibit those behaviors until later when that diagnosis would not have been appropriate. Um, there are common genetic influences, but um, really like over time, like the conversation has been like, should these be parts of a spectrum of behavior? And right now, like the thought is like, no, like these should remain separate, and because they don't all necessarily go together. Um, One thing that is similar, like across ODD and DMDD, DMDD is typically characterized by frequent temper outbursts, whereas ODD is maybe less outbursts, but like just more like consistently like maybe aggravating behavior to those around them. Something that I think is super crucial to talk about as well is the social and emotional impact. Um, we know that if kids are coming into social environments like school, after school activities or extracurriculars, if they're struggling in this way and they notice that they're being noticed by peers and their teachers, um, I know sometimes people think, oh, kids will notice that other people are noticing them and like they'll feel embarrassed and they'll stop doing that. Well, when we are looking at diagnoses like this, um, it's really easy for kids in different environments to become labeled in that way. And they can really easily say, I've already been labeled for being like a bad kid, being a behavior problem. Um, Sometimes like, within the school system, and I don't think it's at all intentional. But when kids move up in a grade, like maybe the teachers that they're coming into contact with, like, oh yeah, like they already know who this child is. And that could be for reasons of safety as well. But it could be that children are like, well, if I'm already going to be labeled in that way, I may as well act up to that label, which just kind of perpetuates the behavior. well, they may feel like they're kind of winning that battle, but then the social emotional impact of that is this child is still not able to regulate, which means that some of the concepts that are being taught, and some of the connection that they're missing out on is going to impact them in later life. Um, I felt like I was super surprised that, I mean, I've not seen a child at 6 years old, like who was receiving an ODD diagnosis, but just knowing that that's a possibility, I'm like, okay. Um, but just knowing that a child that young could be understanding, like, oh, like there is a name for like what's wrong with me. And if parents are not on board with like making sure that that child is receiving like those appropriate therapies, like that appropriate treatment, that could be cause to think like, well, I'm just going to deal with this forever. Like I may as well not even try. Because kind of like we talked about, like some of like those negative, like with dysregulation in kids, that can look like just like negative belief about self, which is also going to impact that social and emotional connection with others that people need to have. Like we are a herd group. Like we need connection with other people in order to feel like we have that sense of emotional safety. Um, and so really for me, like that is kind of the aspect that I focused on in some of my reading the most, um, is like the lack of connection with ODD and DMDD. And then sometimes like the desired lack of connection with conduct disorder, which I think can make people feel really afraid of working with kids with diagnoses like these because, we are also like thinking about self-preservation and we think of, okay, I'm going to be working with this person. They may or may not have regard for my safety. It can be super hard to want to lean in and be present with them in some of this dysregulation because it can feel really scary to us. And so, kind of at the beginning of the presentation, I said just be thinking about people or kids that who may kind of meet some of these criteria. Um, because regardless of it feeling scary, like these kids still need us, like they need us to kind of lean in to be present for some of those really hard moments that they're experiencing. So what this means, so I think like Trudy had asked, like the difference between typical and severe irritability. It's going to kind of go back to how long has this been occurring for and like how much disruption is happening for them and like their and the different environments that they're in, like how much impact is it having in school? Is it keeping them from like forming friendships? Like, to what level is the dysregulation like really playing a part in the way they're able to develop or not? If left untreated, children experiencing mood disorders are at high risk for developing depression, anxiety, and further social, emotional, and possible legal issues. Um, I've never met anybody who has like a long legal history, who has like substance use disorder, who is just really thriving, like really doing well. If we are noticing that like children are involved in the juvenile justice system, there's a need that's not being met, whether they want it to be met or not, kind of like with conduct disorder, like willing to accept, um, acknowledgement for like, hey, like I did these things, because without acknowledgement, someone it really has a hard time identifying like what need they were trying to meet. Um, so just noticing like those kids who are typically like acting the worst, because this can be how it seems to us. Kids who are engaging in behaviors that are just not socially acceptable in a classroom, something is going on there because that child's still like in large part, just depending on the diagnosis, does want to be like seen and accepted, and something is getting in the way of that. Um, so like just things for consideration. There are awful multiple challenges occurring for children who are experiencing an ODD, DMDD, or conduct disorder diagnosis. Um, the best solution, like for a child who's experiencing this, is going to be multifaceted. It's going to involve the school. It's going to involve the parent. It's going to involve whatever providers are involved in making sure this child has care. Um, it may sometimes, like, if a child is on juvenile probation, working with them to make sure that this child is like attending treatment like they're supposed to. We can kind of look at the justice system as like kind of scary because like we don't necessarily want to be involved with it, but we can look at it like, they can be a partner to us if we are working with kids with a diagnosis like this, because maybe they have an ability to enforce follow through that maybe we don't have. We need to consider like how to educate and support caregivers. To me, I think has been the most eye-opening thing. Is just acknowledging like the lack of support, like the lack of resources in the area that I live in, and the journey through diagnosis and treatment of their child. I had watched a couple of videos, just like parents talking about like what it is like to parent a child with ODD, DMDD, or conduct disorder. Um, and something that I noticed is just kind of a sense of like hopelessness some of the time with, we have tried all of these things and like we do not know like how basically like how we failed as parents, like what we can do to help this situation be different. And just acknowledging when we're working with caregivers that this is probably not how they envisioned life for their family to go, and kind of supporting them in the grief of like what parenting looks like versus like what it could have looked like if the situation had been different. Um, Keeping in mind that children living with these levels of dysregulation are experiencing it firsthand. Um, I like to believe that everybody, going through life, they're like, I want to like have good connection with others. Um, and at the very least, like I want to feel happy in the way that my life has turned out. And that could look a million different ways for every different kid that we come into contact with, and every adult as well. And we need to do our due diligence in educating ourselves and others about how to help and not to hurt. Um, I know as a millennial, growing up, like we didn't do a lot of talking about feelings. Like it just wasn't something that I know like my boomer Gen X parents like knew to do. And like no one taught them. So I don't look at that as like a generational failure or anything like that. But just knowing that sometimes like we have to be the ones to bring the information to help and not to hurt. And doing that in ways that are approachable, and are also like taking good care of ourselves as well. So just things to kind of take into account. Professional implication. So training and familiarity with cognitive behavioral therapy, and dialectical behavioral therapy. Not saying that everybody has to like rush out, sign up for a training today to become an expert on that. But if we are therapists, we are mental health professionals, like out in the community, offering those modalities, like really being trained well in that, and understanding like the different diagnoses that could bring to us, giving good informed consent about what that looks like in practice, the implications of using that, risks of therapy. And then parent training or coaching regarding self-care and support of their child. I would say just in all of the reading that I have done, research I've done about these 3 diagnoses, and there are more, there was just really like it was mentioned consistently working with parents on like how to care for themselves and also care for their child. Um, is just so crucial because I know even in trauma work, like we know, like one of the biggest indicators for healing for children is not necessarily the attendance of trauma services for counseling for trauma services, but parental belief, like parental support, feeling like they belong. Because what we know is if kids can't feel safe, like it's really hard to like engage with some of those higher intellectual things we're trying to teach. So just if we're going to be working in the arena of working with these different dysregulative disorders, just being aware that we can do all the training in the world to be the number one best at working with these kids, but really like we can't leave the parents out of that. We need them, and in a lot of ways, like they need us too. Really excellent self-care, like, and I don't mean the bubble bath kind. I mean, if you want to do that, that's fine. I'm not saying don't do that. But just really looking at, okay, why am I getting up and doing this work every day? What is being asked of me and what do I need to do that? Because it is super easy for us to kind of get wrapped up in this legal trouble happened for this child this week, like things that just continue to be really hard because, care for a child like living with one of these diagnoses is not linear. Um, there's going to be forward and backwards pulls with this. Um, Also having a really great awareness of like your surroundings and supports. Um, if you are trained and you're doing work with a family experiencing one of these things, make sure you get like good clinical support, that you're working with someone who you trust to kind of staff cases with, saying, hey, this is what I'm seeing this week. Like, do you have any like thoughts? And just really doing a good job of like processing the way that you're feeling working with these families as well. Um, Healthy boundaries. I know some therapists who are trained in DBT um, can sometimes like have, it's like, I think it's like, I don't want to say it's 24/7 access. I am not highly trained in that. Um, but just knowing that like someone like may need kind of an anchor, like, help with some of that like emotional accountability. And so they offer to be someone who can be reached out to at any time if someone's like noticing they're feeling different urges that could be unhealthy. So just maintaining as healthy of a boundary as you were able to do, recognizing signs and symptoms of burnout, because we do want to help and not to hurt. Um, Education, training, and networking with multidisciplinary treatment teams. Um, that could look like reaching out to local law enforcement and saying, "Hey, I just want to know, would you guys like some information on how, sorry, about conduct disorder?" Um, and just helping them to understand that every kiddo that we run into who's experiencing what could be a conduct disorder diagnosis um, is like suffering in a lot of ways. Sorry. And just helping them to understand like how do we meet that child where they are. Um, One, to like maintain like a positive, collaborative working environment to the best of our ability. Um, and just to share the things that we know and to understand maybe the legal process. Maybe we meet with local residential treatment centers and say, hey, like help me understand like the criteria for this. Do you have recommendations? Do you have some literature that I could share with the family if they have questions about this? So that way when a family asks for that information, like we have it and it's true, correct, and accurate. It goes into knowledge of resources available if a family should need referrals for higher levels of care. I feel like that comes up a lot. Like, I don't really know what to do. Like, can you make some recommendations to me? And knowledge of how and when to report child abuse if needed. So I know I've talked a lot about like parent support, but it's also really important to acknowledge when a lack of parent support kind of falls into a more abusive category, um, like neglect. That could be medical neglect. Like we have a child who is actively suicidal and a caregiver is failing to follow through with making sure this child is evaluated, not wanting to engage in safety planning when I met with a mental health provider. So just knowing that sometimes like we do need to kind of tag like other agencies in just for some support in that way. I've included some resources here. The Oppositional Defiant Disorder Resource Center has a lot of really good information for parents and just mental health providers in general about oppositional defiant disorder. Um, there's also just some printouts, parenting a child with ODD. Um, there's also disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. There's a website here. It's just kind of an overall one-stop shop for information. One thing that I liked about this and why I included is there's also some IEP accommodations if you or like a family that you're working with may not know exactly like what to talk with the school about. There's some suggestions there. A parent's guide for DMDD, and then also Conduct Disorder Resource Center, um, how to help an adolescent, like for parents with conduct disorder, and then just overall we've all worked with caregivers who are like, yes, I'm working with this person, but I don't know like what they can't remember like what someone's credentials mean, or maybe caregivers like don't know like who to ask for, what to look for. So the guide to mental health specialist there at the bottom is just kind of an easy referential guide to who did I just talk to and what do those credentials actually mean. I'm more excited. Okay, I try to be better about time this time.
All right, thank you so much, Shannon. Oh, let me turn my video on. All right, so we did have a few questions. We'll start with the one in the Q&A from Carla. And I think you may have actually answered this one, but I'll read it and then you can see if there's anything you want to add. So it says, conduct disorder used to be a requirement before diagnosing antisocial personality disorder, which could not be diagnosed until the age of 18 with a history of conduct disorder. With these two subcategories under conduct disorder, which one is required now before diagnosing antisocial personality disorder? How have this changed? So I'm thinking when you mentioned that there was a continuum hypothesis for these, maybe that's where that question is coming from.
Yeah. To be totally honest, like I've done so much reading about this, I do not remember the exact answer to that question, just because we don't do a lot of diagnosing here at the center, and it's not a diagnosis that I'm super like familiar with or would be comfortable diagnosing. So that particular piece, I'm so sorry, I do not know the answer to that.
I can speak a little bit to that because I had to
Okay.
go to DSM and look it up because I was like, I don't know that it's actually changed as far as the diagnostic criteria. It does say it has to be conduct disorder symptoms present before 15. So I think that it wouldn't necessarily have to be like a formal diagnosis has made, but kind of in hindsight, we see where this child would have met the criteria or adult at that point because they would be 18. So that's kind of what I was able to dig up on it.
Thank you, Amanda.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I told Mandy, I was like, I wouldn't have known the answer to that unless I looked it up. Because it is something that we don't diagnose very often, or when we do, it's in the pretty extreme cases where you're like, 100% that's what this is.
And so, I mean, thank you for that question though, Carla. I now know that. So thank you.
And then we had one over here in the chat. Can you share again the information regarding ODD and conduct disorder in terms of not all conduct disorder diagnoses will have had a ODD diagnosis?
Yes. So just in the research, looking through it, it looks like with ODD, like symptoms can kind of start to decrease for it looks like around 70% of individuals. So meaning that sorry guys. Just meaning that they would not meet criteria later on for conduct disorder. It looks like around 30% of children diagnosed with ODD like will then go on to receive a conduct disorder diagnosis later. But it looks like around 70% like find that symptoms decrease going into teenage years.
Great, thank you. Another question here. What suggestions or recommendations does your clinic provide school personnel to assist with dysregulated students? So if you could just maybe touch on a couple things.
So I typically talk to our local school counselors. We do a counselor roundtable. I usually talk with them before the beginning of the school year. I really like lean heavily on someone just being like a safe space for students. Like, first of all, like I know I know that our school counselors are busy. I think we need 1 million school counselors in our area, but like I know that's really not in the budget. So when I'm talking with them, um, I first like want to recommend like if a kid comes in and they're really dysregulated, um, kind of looking at like how well do we know this kid? Have they had anything to eat or drink? And I don't know what all the rules are in all the schools for that. But typically it's kind of an easy thing to do to make sure someone has a drink of water just to kind of help us get into that rest and digest, like being able to calm down at maybe we're at a 10. So just kind of making sure we can meet at least one basic need, like have we had something to drink? And if we're seeing like repeated instances of dysregulation in a student or a group of students, um, have they met with those parents? Like, hey, is something going on at home? Like, what do we know about this child, like outside of like these symptoms? But if it's just a kiddo who's really having a hard time and it's like a one-off situation, I might say, have some different things to kind of keep hands busy, offer some water whenever they come in. and just kind of let there be some silence, which I know can feel really uncomfy some of the time, but just kind of let them come in, like decompress for just a few minutes before we start asking a lot of questions about like, hey, like what was going on, which I know can mean there's like a time crunch. Like I know we don't always have all the time in the world. So um just for school personnel, I would say if we can meet a need, let's meet a need. If we can give some space and like some co-regulation, like with them, maybe that means you pick up a fidget, start playing with it. They do that too, and so they can kind of mirror that behavior, and then we'll know that they're engaged in that way.
Thank you.
Mhm.
We had a comment here. Thank you for acknowledging the hesitance and fear of working with kiddos with this diagnosis. They still need connection, even if they present to not at times. Yeah, absolutely. And then we had one more question here, so I think we'll have time for this before our break. I have 2 kiddos on my caseload who were diagnosed with ODD between the ages of 3 to 4. Isn't that a little young for such a diagnosis?
I would think so. I mean, knowing that symptoms typically like can start to onset around age 6. I have certainly met a lot of dysregulated 3 and 4-year-old kiddos. I would be really interested, like, what a differential diagnosis look like for them. Like, what did we roll out to kind of get to that diagnosis? And I would also be curious, like, where were they diagnosed?
Yeah.
Like, where did they receive that? And what was going on at that time?
Yeah, that's a great point. As a testing psychologist, I would say I very rarely diagnose ODD because there's almost something else underlying it, a mood thing, anxiety, parenting issues.
Mhm.
But yeah, 3 or 4, that would be really young. I will say sometimes we have to have a diagnosis in order to get needed
Oh,
services. So
yeah.
that may be a situation where it was like, we just need to put something on paper so that this kid can
Yes.
access what they need. But
Mhm.
yeah, I totally agree. That would be extremely early
Mhm.
to call something a disorder.
Mhm.
In a
Mhm.
child that young.
Yeah.
All right, I think that is all the questions that we had. So why don't we take a break for about 5 minutes again, and then Dr. Wendy Johnson will be up next.
Right.
Thank you again, Shannon.
Mhm.
I'd like to go ahead and introduce our next speakers. Dr. Wendy Johnson is going to speak on interventions to support at home and/or school. Dr. Wendy Johnson is an associate professor of school psychology at Texas Women's University. She's also a licensed psychologist and licensed specialist in school psychology, currently directing the Woodcock Autism Assessment Clinic, where she trains and supervises graduate students as part of a multidisciplinary evaluation team completing autism assessments. Her research focuses on early autism identification and intervention, adverse childhood experiences and trauma, and motherhood in academia. When not working, Dr. Johnson enjoys hiking, being outside, and playing sports with her husband and 4 children. Lauren Fouch will be sharing on interventions for higher levels of care. Lauren Fouch is the CEO of Millwood Hospital, a 134-bed inpatient behavioral health facility in Arlington, Texas, with 4 outpatient clinics across the DFW Metroplex. Lauren's a licensed clinical social worker and has worked in a wide variety of behavioral health settings throughout her career, including inpatient and outpatient settings, crisis intervention teams, and local law enforcement, schools, emergency departments, and medical social work. She began her career working in West Africa as an intern and developed a passion for social work and advocating for underrepresented communities. After receiving her Master of Science in Social Work from the University of Texas at Austin, she has spent her career in the great state of Texas. Her clinical specialties have been around child and adolescent mental health to include play therapy and family interventions. As she transitioned into administrative roles, she found that her clinical experiences assisted in bringing a human-centered approach to both leadership and providing care to those in need. Her passion is helping individuals and families find a place of peace and understanding along their recovery. Thank you to Dr. Johnson and Lauren for sharing your knowledge with us today.
Thank you for that nice introduction. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen here. All right, can you guys see that?
We can.
Okay,
Thank you.
wonderful. Thank you, guys. I appreciate that. Thank you for that nice introduction. So yes, as she stated, I'm a professor, associate professor at TWU, Texas Women's University. This is my 14th year here. So a lot of research around autism, dysregulation, trauma. I'm also a mom of 4 kids, 2 of which are adopted out of trauma. And so I feel like this is an apropos talk in that I feel like I live this every day as well in my home as well as in my professional practice. And so I think it helps to have both that lived experience as well as kind of that research knowledge as well. So even I was chuckling this week, I was telling my husband who's, he's in finance business, not really in this world like we are. And I was telling him about this talk coming up and he's like, oh, that's something you should know about, meaning like we deal with this every day in our home. So a lot of dysregulation and just, how do we navigate that in the home, in the school? How do we support other families that are navigating this and just really do the best we can for these kids who have a lot of disruption and dysregulation. So let's jump in. So the talk today, I'm going to be talking, the first section is going to be just looking at a basic foundation of the neuropsychology that's happening in dysregulation. I think sometimes it's easier to jump to the behavioral side, what we're seeing, the output, but I think it's really important to look at what's happening underneath, really show a good understanding of what's happening in the brain, because even though we have so many things, Shannon did a great job covering a lot of these this morning, but looking at all the different, diagnoses or disability areas or eligibility areas in the schools, and just, conceptualizing the child based on those eligibilities, but really we need to kind of take a step back and really understand what is happening underneath that, what's happening in the brain and the body, and then to get that output that we're seeing as far as the behavior. So be it anxiety, ADHD, autism, the ODD discussion we just had, fetal alcohol syndrome, trauma, toxic stress. I mean, a lot of these things can be happening even as Amanda Smith is talking about, a lot of times when we don't, diagnose like ODD type disability areas, because usually there is something else going on. My response most of the time is jump into trauma, like what happened to this kid, or what did they experience, or what early trauma impacts might there be, even though they may be 10, 11, 12. So often what happens during those first couple of years of life is what's coming out now. And so I think it's really important for us to have that as practitioners, to have that developmental perspective across development, also see if there are some of these significant impactful potential trauma areas that could be manifested in what we're seeing now as far as the dysregulation and the behavioral output. So while so many of these, look different or diagnosed differently or different criteria, I think it is really important to understand that foundation of what's happening in the brain. So first of all, we got to start with the amygdala. It's a little bit itty bitty. It's, the size of a walnut, but if you can believe it or not, even that little piece of our brain is such a crucial impact as far as what we're seeing as in dysregulation. And so we've got all these different components within the amygdala. And the biggest thing to remember with the amygdala is it's how we're processing those emotions. How are we processing, what we're seeing in that output, how are they registering an event around them, whether it's a quote unquote traumatic event or just a normal interaction in life, or normal kids on the playground or whatever it is. How are they registering that? That's what the amygdala is doing. It's determining, am I safe? It's the first question, right? And then, or how do I respond? Or what is that person saying? Or what does that face look like? Like, what are they trying to tell me with those nonverbals? That's what the amygdala is doing. All that's happening at the same time, instantaneously, these things are being perceived and taken in. And so being able to accurately understand what's happening in your environment is a big piece of this that leads to potential dysregulation. And so I think it's really important to understand that the role of the amygdala in that perception of safety. You're going to see it throughout this talk. That perception of safety, that perception of threat is important, because we as adults may see the situation as, well, they're safe, they're fed, there's nothing threatening them in this moment, but it may not matter, because they may perceive something as a threat, or there may be a trigger, from something that happened in the past that we may not even know or understand that could be triggering this fight or flight and, this threatening response that we may not even know. We may just see the behavior and be like, wow, where did that come from? Because we didn't see anything that led up to that, or, it looks like the child is safe, but yet that amygdala is saying, no, threat, I got to respond, fight or flight. So I think it's really important, especially when there's like chronic stress situations. So there may not be like a, one-time major event, life or death, but there could be chronic stress. We see this in kids coming, in poverty, or, chronic stress events that continually, so they're continually elevated where they don't really quote unquote come down from that. There's no, regulation there. They're constantly at that chronic state of dysregulation. It may not be all external, you may not see it, but there could be that internal dysregulation that's happening all the time. And so that chronic level of stress has a significant impact on the brain. So really important understanding that role of the amygdala and how it triggers that fight or flight system within our HPA axis. So this HPA axis, pituitary adrenal system, that's stress responses, and that's what we're seeing. That's how we're responding. Something's happening. So the first step is that amygdala. It's perceiving something, right? Oh no, threat! I got to do something. I got to respond. I got to run. I got to whatever it is, right? And then that second step is once they're registering that, okay, something's happening. Well, then boom, that kicks the body and the brain into overdrive, and you're starting to release the hormones and saying, okay, I gotta go, triggering that cortisol. And so being able to experience that stress hormone as it's being released, that increase of glucose to get you ready to fight, freeze or fawn. And depending on the response and how they choose to respond to that, may determine what that looks like in the output. But as far as what's happening in the body, I think it's really important to understand that your body is responding, and that's what it should do, right? We should have that. That's a good design, and that we can, if there's a situation where we need to respond and we need to run or whatever it is, that's good. We need to be able to do that. But the problem is when this happens, chronically over time, multiple times, like that's not good. That's not healthy for your body to be able to have to respond at that high level over time. That's where it creates that chronic level of impact. And so you also have to think when we're talking about kids and youth is that, this suppresses the immune system. So if this is a chronic thing that's happening over time, the body's consistently in that dysregulated fight or flight response zone, that immune system is being pressed down. So on top of whatever's happening to cause that output, we've also got the body is just physically not able to fight, flu or whatever that's going around, right? And so they could be sick physically on top of the chronic mental stress that's responding in their body. So there's that interaction effect between the physical and the mental output there. So I think the biggest part to remember is that the child may not realize that they're one in that zone of fight or flight dysregulation, but two, they don't realize maybe potentially what the triggers are. That's part of, once we jump to interventions in a little bit, we'll talk about that, but they may not realize that they're even getting to that point or how they got there, or even what the triggers are, especially if we're talking about young kids. They may not realize that they were triggered by, the fluorescent lighting in the room, because was the light that was when they were sexually abused in that same room, so even though it's a different place and they're safe now and they're in a good spot now, that lighting in that certain room triggered something, and they had a physical emotional response, and they may not even be cognitively aware that they were triggered by that. And so that's what we got to think about. Okay, what is this dysregulation telling us, and really try to interpret it through that lens of figuring out kind of what got the child to that point of dysregulation. With the amygdala, we got to also think about the hippocampus, because they have an interaction effect. They work together, complementary. And so the hippocampus, as we know, is a big memory center in the brain. And so we've got to think about how does this chronic stress, chronic dysregulation affect potentially the development of memories or the use of our memory. We do have research that we know that over time, with this chronic level of dysregulation, that the hippocampus actually is smaller in volume in the brain. So the brain is literally responding to this, in that it is not growing as big as it should for these kids that are in chronic stress level situations and chronic dysregulation. So it's very important that early intervention, it's got to be first and foremost when we have kids that are in these tough situations. So really looking at the amygdala is looking at that emotional side of memory, right? So more the unconscious memories that we may not consciously realize, certain triggers or whatever. Those implicit memories, that classical conditioning, right? Go back to your early psych classes, right? Being able to pair things together, be it something you saw, a certain color, a certain smell. That's a hard one because sometimes people don't realize that a smell can be very triggering. Locations, pictures, a certain person. I was recently just reading a story this week about a girl who was raped as a teenager with an older man who had a lot of facial hair, and she's saying years and years later she still cannot be in a room with an older man who has a lot of facial hair because that trigger is just so strong to that traumatic event that happened earlier in life. So that's the amygdala, that's those trauma triggers that is really pulling that out and leading to potential dysregulation. And then within the hippocampus, that's more that explicit memories, what we're learning in school, the factual knowledge, didactic knowledge. It's more cognitively driven versus the amygdala being more emotionally driven, and making that association. So the hippocampus can then make connections between a certain smell or sight or sound and connect it with the memory of what happened in a certain, factual incident. So you've got to have that combination of both of those working together to understand the memory, the feeling, and then understand the memory that is associated with that. So that's how the amygdala and hippocampus work in concert together. We also need to look at how the hippocampus development, I talked about over time. We know that if there's early abuse, preschool, early elementary age, it directly impacts the growth of the brain in the hippocampus, because of that cortisol is just boom, 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 fight or flight all the time. So you just staying at that elevated level impacts how the hippocampus is growing during that time. We are less likely to remember it if it doesn't have that emotional component. But if there is that strong emotional reaction connected to a certain event, then it's going to more likely go on into the hippocampus in that long-term memory fold. So with the decreased volume of the hippocampus for our kids that are in that chronic stress, chronic dysregulation stage, it really hinders how the amygdala is able to interpret that activity. And so that's how this cycle, the kids get stuck in this because it's like they're misinterpreting, the amygdala's firing, misinterpreting the situation, or they're in a chronic stress situation and it's a true threat, which then is impacting the hippocampus, so they can't consolidate memories, or they can't pull from memories, or they're not responding, because they're misperceiving something. And so you're just stuck in this cycle. And so if you picture this kid in the state that I was just referencing, trying to sit in a classroom and listen to a teacher. Well, if their amygdala is firing and they're not feeling safe, their hippocampus isn't learning anything, right? And so they're not able to regulate that emotion, but they may not be able to connect it. So you can see how we may be seeing a kid who's flailing around on the floor or throwing their pencil or whatever. And that's what we see. And we're like, wanting to address that behavior, but really we need to look at what's happening underlying in the brain that's causing that dysregulation. The other main area you've got to talk about when you're talking about dysregulation is the frontal lobes. That is our regulatory abilities of our brain, right? And so it's the last part of our brain to develop, early 20s. And so a lot of our kids and youth, they don't have fully functioning frontal lobes. They're not yet, right? And so especially if there's been trauma or impact or disability or loss, that's going to hinder the development of the frontal lobes. And so, and Shannon referenced this earlier, we may have chronological age of 13, but really they're functioning more like a 9-10-year-old, right? Emotionally. And so chronological age may not always match up to their emotional age or to how they're responding to things. And so this is where the frontal lobe comes into play. Our biggest areas being our ventral medial prefrontal and then the medial prefrontal cortex. Those are the biggest areas in regards to dysregulation with what we're talking about. So the ventral medial, really looking at how to respond to a situation, how do we interpret a certain situation, adapt, how do we change our behavior in certain settings versus other settings. Understanding social conventions, that's a big one, especially for our kids on the autism spectrum or kids out of trauma or even ADHD kids. A lot of emotionally are several years younger than their chronological age as well, and may misinterpret certain social situations. and not fully understand, what is happening or what the expectation is, like a social convention. We maybe act differently sitting at a funeral than we would sitting at a baseball game, right? And so there's social conventions that drive our behavior. But if you don't understand that, you don't know how to regulate your own behavior because you don't understand what the expectations are. We may not directly see an impact in IQ level, like they may be functioning at average level IQ, but we're going to see a difference as far as how they may be able to interpret the situation. I've seen the term, socially dyslexic. So while, academically, IQ level, they may be, average or above average or whatever, but they may miss some of those social cues and not be able to interpret that appropriately. And that's why we see a lot of overlap if we're talking diagnostically, autism and trauma. Lots of overlap there as far as differential diagnosis and really trying to separate out those two. And I'll even add ADHD in there, ADHD, autism, trauma. We've got a lot of overlap there and really take some good diagnostic skills and testing to be able to parcel out those to see, what is truly coming from what area and what diagnosis is appropriate. Getting stuck, like a lot of our kids that are dysregulated, we will see this, I just think of like quicksand, like they're just stuck. Their brain is stuck. They can't move on, they're just, they really wanted to do this one thing and this one thing didn't happen and they just cannot get off of it. You've tried, giving other ideas, you've tried, co-regulating, and you just kind of can't get them unstuck, kind of like almost an OCD level of just stuck, like they have to do it or they have to do this thing. It's just that frontal lobe is just kind of not online right there. They're just not able to regulate that and know, oh, I can do it tomorrow, or it'll be okay, I can still do this. There's not that reasoning within the brain to understand and to respond to whatever the disappointment or the situation was. They may feel slighted, they may misinterpret something somebody said that, wasn't said in a certain way, but may think that way, may think it's directed towards them and maybe it wasn't. Lacking theory of mind is another one we might see impacted by the frontal lobe, where theory of mind being where they can't understand how somebody else may feel in a certain situation. So, two kids are in a room, one kid leaves, the kid who's left in the room does something. What is the other kid going to think who's not in the room? Well, a young child, below the age of 5 or so, isn't going to understand that the child didn't see it who was out of the room. They're going to think, well, I saw that, that ball was moved or that basket was changed or whatever, so they think, oh, that's what the person sees, but they don't understand. They can't take the perspective of the person who was outside the room who wouldn't have seen the same thing. So that's that theory of mind, being able to see what somebody else may see. A lot of our dysregulated youth have a hard time with that theory of mind component. So if we think of it, first, we've got to regulate, top-down processing, regulate that amygdala, how they're being able to interpret certain situations, making sure they're not stuck in kind of that paranoia or something's always happening to me, and just that chronic stress, that imbalance that we're talking about, to be able to regulate it and, try to get that frontal lobe online to be able to interpret a situation and understand it and be able to bring that emotional regulation back down. Because when they're in that chronic state of hyperarousal, then we've got elevated heart rate, the breathing, the sweating, muscles, and obviously you can't learn, adolescent can't learn if they're in that state of dysregulation. And so we need to focus on getting them back down, safety, co-regulation before we can get to that point of learning. It's also important to look at it like the secondary emotions, especially if you're working with younger children, happy, sad, mad, scared, the primary emotions, but then we got to also look at secondary emotions and how those can be, should be learned through interactions, through teaching, through experiences, a little bit more subjective in the understanding of that, what the face looks like, what the body looks like, understanding some of those secondary emotions. But some of our dysregulated kids may miss some of that, right, in their development, be it chronic stress or autism or ADHD or whatever we're talking about. If they're in that state of dysregulation, they're not potentially able to understand some of those secondary emotions or interpret them appropriately. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, where our kids might be coming from. So overall, 20-minute overview of what's happening in the brain here, but important to understand, really foundational to understanding for anybody who's working with dysregulated youth is to really understand what's happening in the brain. And so we've got that amygdala, we've got that emotional understanding, that perception of threat. We've got the hippocampus that works in conjunction with that to consolidate memories, to pull memories, to tie a memory to a certain emotional feeling. And then we've got the frontal lobes, we've got executive functions. I always like the example of a wheel because it just makes sense when we're talking about frontal lobe executive function, right? So you've got a wheel, you've got various spokes, right? You can, maybe lose one spoke here or there and the wheel will still work, right? It'll still function. It may not be optimal, but it'll still work. But once you lose multiple spokes within that wheel, you're not going to be able to go, the wheel is not going to be able to move forward. And so think about that when you're thinking about executive function. You've got to have, working memory, impulse control, organizational skills, mental flexibility, ordering, sequencing, attention, effort. I mean, that's a lot of things that have to happen in our frontal lobe, and that's that wheel of executive function, that all of those spokes within the wheel need to work together. And so if our kids are in this chronic dysregulated state, chances are their working memory is not happening. That's where they have to hold something in their head, do something with it, like mental math or, holding a phone number or whatever it is, and then be able to have an output. Well, that working memory isn't going to be functioning very well if they're in this dysregulated state. Impulse control is going to be very low. Organization, these are the kids, you open up their backpacks and things are falling all over the place, right? And their notebooks, and they can never find their pencil, and their homework never makes it home, and whatever it is, right? Ordering, sequencing, that organizational piece. What are they saying to themselves? Their ability to be mentally flexible. A lot of these kids really struggle with that. That's that stuck brain, right? They're not gonna be able to, or brick brain. I talk about brick brain with my kids all the time. Okay, your brain's kind of stuck right now. What can we do to get it unstuck? How can we move past this, And then just overall attention, effort, being able to put forth, all of that falls under that executive function frontal lobe component. And those are these areas that are going to be most impacted by dysregulated youth. So moving on to kind of the second portion of this talk is going to be the intervention piece. Now that we have this foundation of what's happening in the brain and the body, let's move into the second half of what do we do about it, right? I know Shannon covered a lot of great things this morning. You're going to hear some more as well after me. But let's talk about kind of what this looks like and what are some good steps to getting to regulation, right? That's our long-term goal, is that these kids can self-regulate. They can grow into adulthood, be able to self-regulate. But what do we need to do to get to that point? So I like this quote by Bruce Perry. I like a lot of his stuff. I'm just talking about that fear response is deeply ingrained. If there's any kind of threat of any kind, hunger, thirst, pain, so it could be physical, it could be, some of our core basic needs, shame, confusion, too much, too little, too fast, then they're going to respond. They're going to respond in ways to keep them safe. Their minds will only focus on the information that is at the moment important for survival. Fear inhibits curiosity and inhibits exploration. So when we're talking about, kids and youth learning, growing, we've got to think about it through this lens that they have to be able to be safe. That's got to be our starting point. Safety is our starting point, right? Before we can teach any type of skill, self-regulation skill, etc., we have to start with safety is the first part, and then co-regulation being the second step. So safety is in the eye of the beholder, right? So remember, that goes back to that amygdala, that perception piece. They may seem safe, it may look like it, but if their perception is that they're not safe, or they're responding in a way to some type of real or perceived threat, then they're going to be responding in that way or interpreting a situation. So it has to be we as the adults in the situation, be it the practitioner, the parent, the counselor, whoever's working with a child, we have to be able to help that child feel safe in body and in mind, in that helping to getting them to that point of regulation. I think it's important to really make sure we don't just jump to the behavior and focus on changing the behavior first. I think I worked in the schools for many years, supervised in the schools for many years, we want it to change, right? Even as a parent, right? We want our kid to act the way, we want them to act in the right way, right? We want to change that behavior without necessarily looking at all those things that are underlying behavior, or what happened, what were those antecedents that caused that behavioral output to happen. We just want the child to respond, to do that, to sit appropriately, to be quiet, or whatever it is in the situation, right? And so we really have to kind of step back from the behavior and then start again, at the starting point of safety. Prioritizing the experience of safety, trying to build that platform where the child can grow and do things that previously were difficult for them. It does result in resiliency. So, that's a long-term goal as well, is to build resiliency and really making ourselves be that person of safety, that therapeutic use of self, and what that looks like. Another good quote by Perry: safety is treatment and treatment is safety. So really looking at that as being that core component of where is our starting point. So just a question to think about. I know this isn't really a forum for talking or discussion, but if I was lecturing in one of my classes, this would be a class discussion where we would talk about should we encourage the child to change his or her behavior before we understand the functionality of the child? And I always tell my students, behavior is communication. What is it communicating to us? So if you're in the schools or in a community-based clinic or a home setting, and your child is flopping on the floor and throwing things and, running away or eloping out of the building, or, what is that behavior communicating to us? We see the topography of the behavior. What does it look like? The throwing, the kicking, the yelling, we can see that. That's evident. We can take data on that. But what is that behavior communicating? And that goes into building that relationship with the child and helping them understand why they're acting that way. And when they're not dysregulated, trying to talk to them about it, or try to understand, what antecedents potentially got to that point of complete dysregulation. And so I think we too quickly jump to that changing the behavior and not trying to figure out what is this behavior is a function for the child. They're doing it for a reason. They may not consciously know what that reason is, right? But they are doing it for a reason. It is a form of communication. And so how can we, as the adults working with the child, try to understand how that behavior is communicating, or what that behavior is communicating to us? So it's too often our systems, schools, centers, clients, whatever, we often don't really look at that, the underpinnings of the behavior, but just jump to trying to change that behavior, or look at it in the context of social emotional development. That goes back to the chronological age, emotional age discrepancy, or even looking at it from this developmental time frame of, I like the analogy of like building a house where you've got to have the foundation, early infancy, and I'll even go preterm, before birth, you're developing regulation skills in response to need and response, and then early infancy, early toddlerhood, we're building this foundation of regulation. And so if there's gaps within that, 3 years old, 8 years old, whatever it is, if something happened that dysregulated that growth of that social emotional growth, that regulation, understanding, that stimulus response, I need something, I'm able to cry or communicate that, then that need is met. If some of those early things are not met early on, we see gaps in that development. And so we may have a 10-year-old that we're working with, but we may, if we were able to see kind of their lifespan of development in regards to their social, emotional, regulatory development, we may see significant gaps that happen at 3 and at 7 or whatever, and then we can kind of build our house of social, emotional development, and we can see, okay, well, the foundation here, had some cracks in it, then we built the structure and the pipes and the lights, or, just that analogy of building the house, we may see where those deficits are, and we often have to go back developmentally to that whatever was lost at 3, even if the child is 10, and try to meet that need and go back and relearn or build up that skill that was missed in that early developmental window. So I think that's really important as practitioners to kind of conceptualize this output of dysregulated youth, but we've got to look at it from this developmental time period to see where there potentially are gaps in that social emotional development. And just really try not to use a one-size-fits-all, model to intervene. And, the schools were often overworked, underpaid, as so many are. unfortunately, but we just went, oh, well, this worked for this kid, let's use the same thing, and just really not using that time to be able to get to know the child and see where those individualized needs might be or antecedents that are causing the behavior. So safety, making sure we're conceptualizing the behavior appropriately, seeing the behaviors as challenging, like the child is challenging me as their teacher, or, you know, pushing my buttons or whatever it is, when really it's not a personal attack, although it very much feels that way. And I want to validate that. It feels like a personal attack. It feels very, you know, targeted towards, you know, certain individuals or whatever, but oftentimes, you know, there is something under that that's causing the child to feel unsafe, and then it's coming out towards that, the teacher in the classroom or whatever. So really need to figure out what the behavior is going on, what is the underlying need that the behavior is communicating, and then how do we meet that need? You know, the lower brain is taking over at that time. That's the sensing, the feeling, the reacting is taking over, and we need to get them, you know, back up to the upper brain where they can frontal lobe to try to regulate that behavioral output. So we usually see this coming out in behavior, but we need to backtrack and really try to figure out what's happening underneath. After safety is established as much as possible, the next step is that co-regulation piece. And what does that look like? You know, we are the most important tools in that. The practitioners, the parents, the counselor, the therapist, who's ever working with the child, the team around the child, are really those people that can build these co-regulation skills within the child. You have to have this before you can get to self-regulation. So if our long-term goal is, you know, independent, a self-regulated adult, we really need to work on it from this developmental time frame and look at co-regulation itself. So I think it's important for us to also talk about our own responses, our own triggers, and what that may look like, and to be really aware of how certain things may trigger us as parents, as practitioners, as teachers. There's certain, you know, certain kids or certain ways somebody does something that you have a stronger response. And sometimes in the moment you can't see it, but maybe later in reflection you can see, you know, why did I have such a strong response? Why was I so angry at that person when they really didn't do that much, you know? And sometimes you can connect it to something that happened in the past, or, you know, you can have that automatic, you know, almost visceral response to a certain situation and be like, wow, where did that come from? But in the moment, you may not even realize that yourself. And so I think it's really important for us to be aware, checking with ourselves, how am I feeling, how am I experiencing, even, you know, tag out if we need to, take a break, go for a walk, you know, try to get yourself, if you're getting dysregulated, if your kid is triggering you, or the family you're working with or whatever, you know, really making sure that you're able to stay in that zone of regulation, because you are not going to be as effective if something is triggering you along that way as well. Really trying to seek to build that relationship with the adolescent, shifting the focus from those self-protective responses to really helping the child understand that that's that long-term goal to get there. Like I said, we as adults, you know, when you're a practitioner, caregiver, professional, whatever role you're in, we are the most important tool in that toolkit. You know, we can talk about specific programs all day, but if the people implementing those programs are not able to do it with efficacy or with their own triggers, or, you know, how they do it is as important as what we say. And so I think that's where it really comes into play, where we need to be reflective as the adults working with the child and what that looks like. So prioritizing safety, co-regulation. I think so often we as adults often talk too much. Like we, myself included, you know, in that, you know, we talk as parents, we talk to our kids, or, you know, as practitioners working with kids. It's just, we want to rationalize or talk through, or, you know, get there. And the kid may not be there yet, right? They could still be, maybe they're not actively throwing, yelling, aggressive, but they're still not, you know, completely regulated. They're not hearing you. Like there's too much talk going on so often. So sometimes we just have to use our physical presence for a long time until the child is able to talk about it, or they may not even be there yet to be able to talk through something. But too often I have seen situations where it's just too much verbal language going on and the child is just not processing it. But not just the language itself, but our presence, how we're presenting those language, our tone, our prosody, how quickly we're talking. I think that's another thing. I can talk too fast. And so it's just like slowing our body down, slowing our words down, how we say things. Our facial expressions also may not, the child may have difficulty interpreting that, what that looks like. Our posture, our bodies, I think especially if you work with younger kids, you've got to be really aware. Even just standing next to them can feel, can create a power differential and then could feel threatening, depending on how they perceive that. So really looking at that co-regulation and what your body is doing or how you're saying it, what that looks like. Just some informal ideas. These are the ones that you just kind of keep in your back pocket just to kind of use if you need to, in the moment to really help a certain situation. Somebody asked earlier about, in the schools, what do you do in a situation where the kid is highly dysregulated, trying to either clear the classroom or clear the child out of the classroom or get them to a place that's safe. And, they're kicking, screaming, yelling, throwing, and you're trying to keep everybody safe. And some of these things are more apropos for a home setting or a clinic-based setting, some for school, but just some things to keep in mind. I think Shannon talked about this, adding water, meeting some of those needs as far as drinking and taking something in, food, but also adding water as far as like regulation. When my twins, or the two that are adopted, when they were younger, they're 7 now, but when they were, 2, 3, 4, water, and actually we still do it sometimes, taking a bath, a bubble bath, playing in the little water table, even just like pouring water in cups back and forth, just anything like that is calming. Water can be very calming. Licking, sucking, stimulates that polyvagal nerve, which helps calm the system. And so that licking process, the taste, the chewing, you've got some deep pressure there that can help regulate. Scripting versus lecture, I think this one's important. Again, we kind of automatically jump to lecture talking too much, but scripting is different than lecture in that usually it's just a short phrase, it's consistent, it's used frequently, the child knows and understands it, it's said in the right way. An example of this, when my twins, when they were first adopted, they were 15 months old, so pretty young, but no language. Developmentally, they were tested at like 7 or 8 months. So itty bitty, super tiny physically, but also emotionally, about half the age of their chronological age. No language at the time, and lots of just dysregulation, 1, 2, 3 years old. And so I would take my son and I would hold him and I would say, "You are safe, you are loved. You are safe, you're loved," while rocking, while holding him, rubbing his back. So, safe touch, but also like a safe hold. But then it's the scripting is, "You are safe, you are loved. You are safe, you are loved." And we still do it at 7, not as often, not as much. He still gets dysregulated, but we don't do as much of even just the other night, I did hold him. We weren't rocking, I did hold him, rub his back, and so it's just like, those scripts can be calming, can help regulate. I know that would look different in a clinic setting or a school setting, but you could do something similar as far as the scripting, or maybe just a hand. You have to be careful with touch because sometimes touch can be more dysregulating. So that goes back to knowing your child and what can be regulating for them. But if touch is a safe thing for them, sometimes just a hand on the shoulder or holding their hand gently, something like that could be regulating, and adding a script with the safe touch may be something that really helps that child. Breathing, simple choices. I think be careful with this one too, because remember the frontal lobe is not activated when they're dysregulated. And so you're going to have to be very careful on how you use the choices because they're not going to be able to make decisions. It can even be something as simple. My daughter, the twin, sometimes it's like, "Do you want the red dress or the blue dress?" Like either one's perfectly fine. It's not a high stress situation. There's no dysregulation happening, but sometimes she's even not able to just make a choice, even just a simple choice. So be careful. They have to be regulated enough to even make a choice. How can I help? Cold sometimes helps. Moving your body, but in a safe way. Jumping on a trampolines can help. Pushing, pulling. Doing some type of physical, we talked about tangible or eating, drinking, tangible items, sand, Play-Doh, sometimes that can be very regulating. Music, riding around a car, humming, Humming actually also stimulates the vagus polyvagal nerve, and so that can have a calming effect. Humor can help if you're kind of at the early stages, like trying to prevent a meltdown. Smells can be, again, knowing your child is going to be important and what's going to be important for them. De-escalation strategies in the moment. We've talked about some of these, but making sure they're safe, providing those safety cues, staying regulated yourself, limiting what you're saying. Remember, they may not hear you, may not be able to process what you're saying. Really try to respecting how they're communicating to you. If they push you away, fine. Physically move yourself away enough to where you can still keep them safe, but you're not physically right there. Staying low and slow, even for older kids, trying to get down on their level. If they're sitting down, you need to sit down. Like, don't be standing over them. Try to match their rhythm. And then when they're not dysregulated, really try to, work through what that looks like and how you can help them next time. So review, safety is our starting point, really work on co-regulation. And then third, this last step is self-regulation, right? That's our goal, is to get them to the self-regulation. I liked Titzelman's breakdown here, kind of looking at self-regulation across 4 domains. So if we're looking at self-regulation of emotions, self-regulation of social skills, self-regulation of physical, and self-regulation of cognitive. And I'm not going to take the time to go through each one of those, but I do think it's important to think about it instead of just kind of saying, oh, we're working towards self-regulation. Well, what does that look like? How does that look like? What domain are you going to be focusing on? And potentially even have goals in these different areas. Okay, we're going to be working on self-regulation of social skills, self-regulation of physical body, self-regulation of cognitive, and really break down what that looks like across those different domains of self-regulation skills. Top down, so we're really working on getting that prefrontal cortex activated so that they can direct their behavior. They can learn that. That's got to start early on. Those bottom up behaviors, bottom up of the brain, is that more reflective, reflexive, survival brain. And so really need to try to look at this from a social emotional developmental perspective. It is important to think about this starts in the first couple months of life, what the child is exposed to, especially in the family unit, the early relational interactions during those first couple of years really sets the stage. So you may be working only with 15, teenagers, adolescents, but you really got to go back and see kind of what that early family life, early, exposure, those first couple of months, first couple of years of life. So safety is established. You've learned, you've gotten to know the child, the youth, what some of the triggers are. Now we're trying to help them instead of you, helping them identify what the triggers are. Now they're going to help self-identify some of those triggers, talk about their feelings, talk about identifying them. My body is telling me this. My eyes are telling me this. My tummy is making these noises, which means I'm hungry, and really trying to connect their body with the understanding what that looks like. One-on-one interactions are huge, really building that, letting the child, when they're younger, letting them lead the play and you responding supportively. When they're older, that's going to look a little different as far as what those interactions look like. But remember, it's not necessarily chronological age, but developmental age. But really using play, way too much technology now with our kids and what they're exposed to. But we really need to go back to just play, because play is where they learn some of these early developmental regulation skills and interaction with peers, and just even digging in the yard, just being able to regulate themselves through motor activities, through play. It's really important for that early social development, which then leads on to, if they don't have that later on, can lead to that dysregulation. Sensory. Again, early on, trying to figure out what works for the child. Like I said earlier, touch or water or, jumping, whatever it is, some of those sensory movement activities, really see what's going to work for that kid. For some of these kids, it can dysregulate them even more. And so you got to make sure that it's going to be a calming effect for that child. Always look at sleep, nutrition, exposure to screens. Unfortunately, that is another factor we have to calculate in now. There's lots of literature on, unfortunately, what that's doing to our young kids' brains. And so we need to be really aware of that. Here's some specific models of interaction. I'm not going to go into those, and I know Ashley will cover some of those. So really just looking at this broader from this development of safety and co-regulation, and then building up those self-regulation skills, and how do we as practitioners working with children to really be able to help them get to that point to find solutions, and building the self-awareness, right? We hope that to get these, older youth, adolescent, young adults to get to that point where they can connect their mind with their body and learn what they have to do about it. What should I do? Okay, I know when I'm feeling this, it means this, and I need to do this, right? You're able to use that frontal lobe to problem solve and be able to get them to the point where they can regulate themselves and respond appropriately. And really shifting it from behavior to relationship and building that so that the child can build self-awareness and perception within themselves. So most important, you are the most important person in your toolbox, and building that human connection in order to increase that ability to regulate. So, questions?
We have a few questions in the chat. Do you have any advice for parent educators in terms of helping parents when we begin to open up about their kiddos feeling safe?
So, is the question in relation to parents? Like, how do you respond to parents when they're concerned about their child's? Can you repeat that?
I'm not sure.
Okay. Maybe just repeat the question again. I'll try to answer it.
Okay. Do you have any advice for parent educators in terms of helping parents when we begin to open up about their kiddos feeling safe?
Gotcha. So maybe, I hope I'm interpreting this correctly, but the parent may not be setting up a safe environment. And so then the practitioner has to navigate that carefully to emphasize that the child is responding out of that feeling of being unsafe. I think you got to work both ways, because chances are the parent probably also is responding out of a trauma response as well, in a sense of dysregulation. And so then they're not able to meet the child's needs or set up an environment that is safe. Chances are they're also, coming from that perspective. And so I think I would look at it more holistically and systemically, and not that anyone would try to blame the parent in any way, but don't want that to be perceived that way, right? And so looking at it holistically, and how can we create an environment where the child feels safe? Is there even a corner of the room where they have their special pillow and their special blanket, and that's their corner? Maybe nobody else can have that corner, right? That's where they read, that's where they curl up with their special stuffy or whatever. An adolescent, that may look different, but maybe they have something where they can feel safe in that area. And so try to look at it, and how do we support the parent in helping the child develop something where, again, they can go, okay, they're starting to feel upset, they can go to their special corner or whatever it is, and trying to build a system around the child where the child can seek out and get those safety needs met, even when the parent may not fully be able to understand it. They may be a piece of that.
Thank you. Next question. Why do some people feel more upset if you maintain yourself calm during their crisis while you're listening to them? How can you improve the situation without the other person getting out of control?
Yes, that's a great question. I think you just have to stay the course. I mean, obviously, if you respond, so I think that, you're two people are working with a child or together, one person's getting dysregulated, one is still staying calm, but then by you staying calm, the other person's getting more dysregulated. But if you rise to that, because so often, especially when our kids with power struggles, right, you rise and then they go higher, and then it just escalates. So it doesn't help anything if you kind of rise to the emotional level of the room and the tension. I think sometimes, again, depending on the situation, if somebody can tag team out, like when I was in the schools, we always made sure we had 3 people in a situation, especially if we had to restrain a child or whatever, so that somebody could tag out. And I think that goes back to that piece of knowing ourselves and knowing if we're getting dysregulated or triggered in any way, maybe we need to go to the water fountain or go take a drink, or, we need to take a 2-minute break or whatever. And sometimes, that's not always possible depending on the crisis situation. But I think it goes back to us knowing ourselves and what our triggers are, and also knowing, the people we're working with or the situation. And if there is a way to, kind of nicely, tag out and somebody just have a natural plan. And I think this is where planning comes into play. I know we can't always know when something's going to happen, But if there's a situation where a kid is continually dysregulated and you kind of see these patterns and it happens, once a week or twice a week or whatever, you can set up systems and you can have the plan in place, even if colleague A might not be the greatest fit for this type of situation, you may have a plan already in place in order to help modulate that when the situation does occur again.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions?
We actually had, I see that we have someone who, Angelique, I'm going to unmute you. I see that you have your hand up and wanted to ask a question.
Thanks. So I'm the one who posted the question about the parents as a parent educator.
Oh,
We
yes.
talk about health safety. We talk about, I add to that signs of stress in your kiddo, what that could look like, and that what we're seeing that we think maybe bad behaviors may just be, this is how I respond when I'm stressed. But occasionally it can be hard to help a parent understand that that their kids don't feel safe when
Right.
that parent knows that, or at least believes that, hey, I know that she is. So,
Yeah.
and in helping a child to feel safe, we have to also help that parent to feel safe enough to be vulnerable in that moment, to be accepting that
Absolutely.
I'm trying to work with you, I'm
Sure.
trying to help.
Definitely.
So that's what I was asking about. Like, is there any advice, tips, or whatever when we are talking about felt safety, helping your child to feel safe when it can be offensive to that parent to have to hear your child doesn't feel safe in this moment?
Yes, and I validate that's a hard one because you obviously have to tread carefully in how you handle that. I mean, part of me says it goes back to relationship with the parent too. We work a lot with building that relationship with the child and as the client, but when you're working with a child or youth, you have to see it as the system around the child, which obviously the parent is a significant part of that system. And so it goes back to building a relationship with the parent too, like you said, so that they can feel safe enough to even hear that, or work together. So I don't know if there's some type of avenue you can use to even just meet with the parent separately without the child or youth in the room, or somehow build that rapport with the parent too, to create situations of understanding so that they can then better meet their needs of their child.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. Thank you for sharing your words with us and answering our questions. I'd like to now turn the time to Lauren Fouch, who will talk to us about interventions for higher levels of care. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you, everybody. It's always intimidating to be the last speaker after two fantastic speakers and also be the last one keeping many of you from your lunch. So I will try to keep it engaging and interesting for you all. In full disclosure, like I said, my name is Lauren Fouch. I am the CEO at Millwood Hospital. So a lot of these levels of care that we are going to talk about today is something that Millwood Hospital does offer, but I don't want this to be a sales pitch about what Millwood does and does not do. I want to talk about levels of care that you may see in various settings. So I just want to talk about that a little bit and kind of start off with that. So like I said, I'm a social worker. I have a clinical background working with children and adolescents. I fell in love with working with kids when I was in graduate school and working in an elementary school. I never thought I'd go the clinical route. I definitely thought I was going to go more into nonprofit management and international social work, but really found that I love working with kids, especially elementary age, and working with the families, because that's really where so much of the work takes place. And finding that when I see adults with chronic illness and start to really go back into, their history, finding that, really we started to see some of these signs early on. And had we been able to provide some education, interventions from an early age, maybe they could have had better outcomes as they get into adulthood and maybe been more successful. So that's really what I love from a clinical standpoint, is being able to provide these interventions and give these kids and these families hope that their diagnosis does not define them or their future, and that they do have hope for having successful lives and being functioning members of society. So I want to spend a little time today talking about kind of sharing screen as I'm talking. I apologize, but you know, we've had some amazing conversations already today about what dysregulation looks like in kids, what's going on, what are some of the factors that may be going on in their brain as well as environmentally, and what we can do to support them. But as we just talked about, is, you know, safety being the #1 priority. And many of you have probably had experiences working with children and families where we're providing these on-site interventions. We are working with families and providing them with skills and education. And this is probably something that has now escalated to a point where we aren't the appropriate setting, whether that be in a school environment, community environment, a traditional outpatient space, and somebody may be needing higher levels of care. So what does that look like? When do we know when somebody needs a higher level of care, and what are those levels is kind of what I want to spend time talking about today. So high points of what I want to review today is the importance of higher levels of care. What are those interventions, and what are some of this, you know, managing some of these difficult adolescents and the parent support and education. So when I say higher level care, what does that mean? It can mean a lot of different things. It can be an intensive outpatient program. You'll hear a lot of times IOP. You may hear PHP, partial hospitalization program. You may hear a phrase, another acronym, RTC, or inpatient or acute care. In healthcare, we love to use acronyms. So those are always really important that we slow down and really explain when we say what a PHP or IOP or RTC, what do these letters mean? And what does that look like a day in the life for the person receiving that treatment? So I'll go more into what each one of those levels of care are. Also, when somebody may need higher level care is, it's not just emotional dysregulation, but it's severe. It's when safety is something that we're really looking at. They are at a high risk of harm for themselves, a high risk for harm for those around them. And on top of that, we have tried lower levels of care, least restrictive environments, and have been unsuccessful. So we'll go a little bit more into what those levels of care are. And I'm going to start with the most severe and work our way down. So the first being acute level of care. This is what we think of with inpatient treatment, hospitalization. This is, to me, the last case resort. It's ironic to hear that as somebody who works in an inpatient hospital, but I would love to work myself out of the inpatient business. I want to get to a point. My dream is at some point in my career, we never see children hospitalized. How can we intervene before it gets to the point of requiring acute hospitalization? So the reason why this is, well, I don't want to skip slides, but this is our highest level, most intense treatment option, and it's really invasive. And quite honestly, can be pretty traumatic for children and for families. So we really want to avoid inpatient hospitalization as much as possible. However, we have sometimes have children and adults who we have tried these other options and they failed, and they are requiring that level of care due to safety. A PHP, that stands for partial hospitalization program. These are day treatment programs. I'll go a little bit more into what that looks like, what a day in the life looks like, as well as IOPs, intensive outpatient programs. Both of these are day treatment levels of care, but they're just a little bit different. So I'll explain what those are. And then RTC, it looks like it's below IOP here. I'm not the most tech savvy, so I couldn't figure out how to move the square over a little bit. It's not really linear. It's really more of an alternative and more of a dotted line, I would say. So it's not necessarily, you know, outpatient goes to RTC to IOP, PHP, and then acute. It's really another option when PHP, IOP, and acute levels of care, we've tried them over and over and we're not seeing the results that we want. So I'll talk a little bit more of what that looks like as well. And then outpatient is what we think of in more of traditional outpatient therapy settings. You see a therapist, you know, once a week, maybe twice a week, or a couple times a month. You maybe see a psychiatrist every couple months, and medication management. This is kind of what most people think of when they are seeking therapeutic services. So acute psychiatric care, this is 24-hour monitoring. These are locked facilities. They are short-term. So we've seen where sometimes there's a lot of confusion with families that they think that they are going into treatment for an extended period of time. Most hospitalizations, especially for children, are going to be 5 to 7 days. The goal for inpatient hospitalization is not deep intensive therapy. They are really receiving group therapy, but they're really not getting a whole lot of intense one-on-one therapy. It's really not the setting for that, because the goal of inpatient hospitalization is a medical model. It is that you're seeing a psychiatrist every single day. It's aggressive medication management. I always like to tell families, we are not opening the cans of worms to figure out what's going on behind this behavior. We're kind of putting the worms back in the can to give a nice little package for you to work at a different level of care. This is that there's an imminent risk to yourself or others. Reasons for this level of care would be an actively suicidal, actively homicidal. There's psychosis that is resulting in safety issues. So they are requiring that somebody is laying eyes on them 24 hours a day, every 15 minutes at the minimum. You may even require some of our kids and adults at this level of care are what we call a Q10 or Q5, meaning that a staff member is checking on them every 5 minutes or every 10 minutes to make sure that they're safe, or even a one-to-one where they have a mental health worker that is with them within arm's reach at all times to keep them safe. It is invasive. You know, this is when they're sleeping at night, when they are using the restroom, when they are in group therapy, somebody is laying eyes on them that often to make sure they're safe. So that's why we really want this to be the last case resort. The other reason, as a mom and as a therapist and as somebody who worked in medical settings as a social worker prior to being in mental health, when we think of hospitals, you know, medical hospitals and a loved one going to the hospital, we have the opportunity to be with them the whole time, unless they're in isolation or something like that. But most of the time, if somebody's in the hospital, we get to be with our family members. We get to stay in the room with them. When the doctors come in or the nurses are coming in and they're rounding, we get to ask those questions. When your family member is in an acute psychiatric care, you can't be on the unit with them. They're in group therapy, they're going to recreational therapy, they're seeing the doctors, they're receiving that intensive monitoring, and that can be really hard for parents and really hard for kids. I think about this about when we do admit somebody who is 5, 6, 7 years old. This might be the first time they've ever been away from their parents, and definitely the first time they ever spent the night somewhere other than their own home. And they are now in this group environment that somebody's coming in and out of their room, that they are, scared, they miss their family. So really we want to make sure that when we are admitting a child into this level of care, it really is kind of the last case resort, that this is something that we can't treat in a lower level of care. It's just, it is necessary for some children, but we really want to try to avoid it when possible. The next kind of level, what we like to see, this is my favorite level of care. It was my favorite as a clinician as well too, is partial hospitalization program. You're going to be seeing a therapist every day. This is more focused on the therapy modalities with the doctors kind of extra, versus when you are in the hospital, it's really focused on the doctors, the one driving the treatment team, with therapy as a bonus. So the therapist is really driving this. That is a day treatment. Every program is a little bit different. So I'm going to talk kind of in generalities of what a PHP level of care is required to have. And then every program is a little bit different, whether that be specialty program or if they've got, art therapy or, school components. Every program has its own feature. So really looking at what's best for the family and this kiddo and making sure we really individualize what they need by referring them to the right level of care. But all of them will have group therapy 4 hours a day. That is the requirement from a regulatory standpoint as well as from a reimbursement standpoint. So it's going to be 4 hours of group therapy every single day. But most of them are 5 days a week. There are some programs that are 7 days a week, but when I have tried those in the past, I found that the patients really get burnt out. That's a lot of therapy in 1 week and not having any kind of break. And then they also will include family therapy, because especially for our children, we know that this is so much of where the work is needed. And, working with the families to help them have some education of what the treatment plans are, what the medications are, what's going on with the child, and how the parents and the siblings can best support them and work with them. Most programs for this level of care are going to be about 4 to 6 weeks. So what I really loved when I worked in a PHP level of care was this is where you got to do a lot of the real work. This is where you get to really start to do intensive therapy. I love group therapy, especially with kids, because I think it normalizes some of their experiences. They feel less alone. It helps with, understanding what is normal from a developmental standpoint, as well as, just that they're not the only person that feels this way, which we see a lot of times with our teenagers. They feel that what they're experiencing, they're alone in that. So I love this level of care because I feel like you can do a lot of intensive work. When I would have families that would say, why do I need to do this versus just going and seeing my therapist once a week? I'm saying I'm doing 20 hours of therapy with your loved one. And so if you are able to see your outpatient provider once every 2 weeks, that is going to be years worth of therapy I'm able to accomplish in a week. So, this is something that I can help you and your family get better faster. So then when you do go to that traditional outpatient space, you're able to, you've unpacked some of this and we're able to work more and have stabilized some of the acute behaviors. But the real big thing here too is that they get to see the provider. It's required to see the physician at least once a week, but a lot of programs, they actually see them more often, twice a week. What we try to do, particularly with children, is keep them at this level of care and avoid a hospitalization. So if we have a kiddo who may be starting to have side effects or symptoms from a medication, or the behaviors are escalating, maybe they might get seen every single day by the doctor in the PHP setting instead of trying to go to the hospital. So another reason I love this is that the skills as a clinician that I'm teaching you in a group setting and that we're working on, you get to go practice them at home. When you're in a hospital setting and you're inpatient, you're kind of in a bubble. And so we can talk about these things kind of in a concept or theoretically, but then our clients are able to go home, practice those skills, come back the next day. And how did it go last night? Oh, me and my mom got in a really big fight. Okay, let's unpack that. Let's work on that a little bit more and try again tonight. Maybe we bring mom in, and when she comes to pick you up today, we do a brief family therapy to discuss it all together. And so we can try again tonight. So as they start to step back into the quote unquote real world, so they're able to use these skills, but still be in an intensive environment. The next step down is an IOP program. So what's the difference between PHP and IOP? They're both day treatment programs, but this is a little bit less intense. It depends on the program. Some of them are still 5 days a week, but a lot of times you'll see programs, they kind of step them down to 3 days a week. And it's only 3 hours instead of the 4 hours. They also get less medication management at this level of care. So when you're in the hospital, I always tell families this is, really focused on finding the right med. So we're just trying to figure out what is the medication that works the best for you. In a PHP level of care, now we've maybe figured out the right medication, but we're trying to figure out the right dose. And maybe it's too high or too low. We're trying to figure out where that sweet spot is. And then in an IOP program, we're really focusing on the therapy component and making sure that that medication really is working long-term, but we're not really making medication adjustments. Some IOP programs don't even have a physician seeing the patients. They'll say, go see a traditional outpatient psychiatrist once a month to get your refills. We're only focusing on therapy here. Some IOP programs only see once a month, In our IOP programs, they see the physician once a week. So it really just kind of depends on which IOP program you're in. You'll see a lot more options with IOP for being virtual. PHP programs, there are some virtual programs for them. In my experience, doing a PHP 4 hours a day with kids, all virtual, can be really difficult. Maybe I'm not a strong enough clinician, but as a therapist, I really struggle to keep, 10 teenagers actively engaged for 4 hours over Zoom. So you don't see quite as much with that, but you start to see more IOP programs going virtual, especially for more of our rural areas. This is a great way for people to be able to have access to mental health treatment and really intensive quality, but if it's not provided in their community, an IOP option is great. What I really like about IOP too is being able to phase down from all day therapy to 5 days a week to then going to 3 days a week. And then even in addition to going home at the end of each day, they also get to maybe go to school 2 days a week. So maybe they go to IOP Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and they go to school Tuesday, Thursday. And that's a way to also practice some of these skills and make sure they're transitioning back into home life and school life in a safe way, and that they can still have those follow-up services. Next is the residential treatment center. So it's not necessarily step down, but this is kind of an alternative. So these can vary by program. In the state of Texas, there are not many residential treatment centers. There's also not a lot of inpatient treatment centers or even PHP or IOPs that treat young kids. I can spend an entire webinar talking about the reasons why. I will just basically say with this, that if this is something you want to talk more about or why there's less services for that, help me advocate with the state of Texas. We're about to go into a legislative session, but it really boils down to Medicaid. Medicaid, traditional Medicaid does not cover the PHP or IOP level of care or residential treatment center. Some managed Medicaids do, but then what we also find is a lot of providers for this RTC level of care don't accept the Medicaid products. So many of our children are in the state of Texas are covered under a Medicaid product, so they may not have access to something like a residential treatment center. So what is RTC? RTCs are longer term. This is where we're not necessarily focused on treating the mental health component through like medication management, but we're really focused more on behavior management. These can vary anywhere from 2 months to 6 months to even 18 months, depending on the type of program it is, what's going on. Like I've actually made referrals to some out-of-state RTCs that focus on like reactive attachment disorder, eating disorders, some really intensive DBT and trauma programs, and those you'll see as longer programs. That'll be those 6 months, year to 18 months. This is going to be more of like a therapeutic boarding school, really, for lack of better words. So they usually will have a pretty intensive school component to it, where they've got, whether it be a charter school or something through their local school district, because the kids are in treatment for so long. So we don't have any private RTCs in the DFW area for children and adolescents. So the closest ones you're going to start to see are more like in the Austin area. There are some residential treatment centers that have contracts through CPS, DFPS that are in the DFW area, but that has to be a child that is in foster care for them to have access to those RTCs. So this is a really big deficit in our state for kids who are needing to not be in a home environment, but they don't necessarily need that intensive hospitalization, because again, that's short term. And state hospitalizations, the concept of sending somebody to a state hospital where they stay there for long term, that no longer exists. The state hospital system is really that acute level care. Most people are in a state hospital for only a week. And again, that's a whole complex issue of how to even get into a state hospital. So this is, in my opinion, somewhere that I think our children need more services, and would love to be able to provide more RTCs for kids who need this type of intervention. But again, going back to how do we make sure that our kids are in the least restrictive environment? We're not just locking them away in these residential treatment centers or these acute hospitals, because they really, the long-term benefit of that starts to plateau when they're in those environments for too long. They really need to be back with in their family environment and their school environment. So that's a whole nother day. So what do they do in these RTCs? What types, or in RTCs, but any of these levels of care? It can vary. I wish I could say, okay, they always use CBT, but they do a lot of CBT in acute hospitalizations because they're focusing a lot on skills. And then DBT, you'll start to see more in your outpatient programs, your day treatment programs, or those RTCs. For me, I feel very strongly that for any of these levels of care and any of these evidence-based interventions to be effective with these children, it has to have the family component. I will say to families when a child comes into our care that family therapy is a requirement. You can't just bring your kid to the hospital and it's not respite for the entire family, but that the family has to be involved. They have to continue with that family therapy while they're in our care, as well as we'll make those referrals afterwards, because we know that so much of what is going on with this child is being impacted by their environment. And so how do the families have the skills and the training, because we're treating all of them, not just this kid who's sitting in front of me, but helping mom and dad understand what this particular diagnosis may mean, what this medication does, and what kind of things that they need to look out for. How do we safety plan? How do we make sure that when they go home, the kiddo is safe, as well as the siblings are safe, the pets are safe, mom and dad are safe, teachers are safe. What do we need to do to keep everybody safe, and how do we identify these things in the future before it escalates to a crisis state for somebody? So some strategies for managing some challenging behaviors. This is a little bit repetitive. I feel like my previous presenters went into much better detail about de-escalation techniques. So again, that's a whole training that we could do just on some de-escalation techniques that I think are really important to teach families as well as us as professionals. When I say behavior contracts, these, be intentional with these behavior contracts and careful with them. Sometimes they can backfire on us. So we need to have clear communication about expectations and what we're needing to see. However, if a child is experiencing a mental health crisis, are we setting up expectations that are reasonable for whatever their capabilities may be? We don't want to set them up by saying, here are the expectations and here are consequences, when they may not be able to achieve that, and then we have a negative outcome from that. But really what we see as the most effective is positive reinforcement. So we have seen, I'll share one story related to Millwood Hospital, that we created a behavior reinforcement program for our inpatient hospital that we have rolled out into our outpatients. It's called a balance day. And so research really shows that in any setting, that focusing on the positive behaviors instead of what we don't want them to do, but this is what we do want them to do, are incredibly effective. And we noticed it firsthand how our units became a much more therapeutic environment when we were enforcing the good. I think a lot of times, especially in environments with a lot of children, whether that be in a school setting or, whatever that looks like, when, there's so many children, as teachers or counselors or, in summer camps, whatever, we're telling the kids what we need them to not do and trying to get compliance. And they need to hear more positive reinforcement, things that they're doing well, and really building up that resilience and that self-esteem. So we have seen that to be incredibly effective. So I talked about, parent involvement is a requirement really for this child to have the best outcome. So what does that look like? How do we engage them in the treatment process? Most important thing for me is the education. So, providing education about mental health, in general, just kind of some generics about what is the difference between depression and anxiety and how it looks different in children than it may look in adults. That some of these symptoms that you're seeing, some of these behaviors that you're seeing are really a symptom of a diagnosis. And, it's how anxiety looks in a child may look more like aggression or sleep disturbances or, somatic symptoms or whatever. So providing that education to parents, as well as this is what the treatment plan is. This is what our recommendations are, but not just us telling parents what that is, but getting their input. Because I can't tell you how many times I've talked with a parent and saying, okay, our recommendation, we want to try this. And they're like, we've already tried that. Maybe we already did a residential treatment program, or we already tried this medication and then this happens, and if you don't get that information from the parents, you're driving blind. So I think that's really important to engage them in why we're doing what we're doing and are they in agreement to it. So that way we have better compliance after they leave the hospital setting. And then the family therapy component, because if we have gotten to a point of a child in crisis, there's probably some other external factors going on and maybe some trauma for the family involved. They probably have witnessed some pretty scary things, some scary behaviors from the child. This may be a mother who walked in on a suicide attempt of her child, and that is something that mom will never forget. And so how are we supporting her through that? How are we supporting the siblings through that? How are we making sure that, they have the support that they need, as well as how do they communicate their needs to one another? And then having parents involved daily in, how they did, updates on, they really, and we want to maintain our patient confidentiality, but still, they really participated well in group, or they seemed, like they're having a hard time today. Did something happen last night? Or, oh, they didn't sleep very well last night. Oh, well, that's important. So I can see why they, but then maybe I need to share that with the doctor, that they're not sleeping well, or, diet, how is that impacting things? So, if you don't involve parents in the treatment, you're missing it. I had a conversation with one of my therapists semi-recently of, you can't take a 8-year-old's word for it of how things are going at home. You really need to ask mom and dad and even siblings how things are going, because their perception can give a very interesting picture of what's really happening in their lives. So, okay, so we've something happened, there was a crisis, and we had to send a kiddo to a hospital setting. There was a suicide attempt or an overdose or something happened and it was scary. They went to the hospital, I did great, things have stabilized. They went to a PHP setting. They, did some really great work in their therapy. The families are really involved. Now what? How do we get back to that quote unquote real world? I know I was kind of looking through who some of the attendees are. We've got a lot of school professionals on the call. So I'm so grateful for you all because this is something that I think that I see a lot when it comes to digging into maybe if a kiddo comes back to the hospital, how do we integrate back into the school environment? I hear from school counselors saying, the kid's been out of school for a week and then all of a sudden they show back up and I find out they were in a hospital. Nobody told me. And so I wasn't prepared for them to come back. And so first is improving communication between providers and families and the schools. As school professionals, you need to know what's going on at home or outside of the school environment so you can support that kid. You don't want to, assume they were out with the flu and then find out that they had a hospitalization and, maybe we didn't handle things as sensitively as we probably would have wanted to. So communication, if, they are coming back, so the parents telling, but also, giving you as professionals, the information about their hospitalization. Are they on medications? Is there a crisis safety plan that was put in place that between the parents and the child and the, professionals that these are identified triggers so you guys can work through that. But also understand the most high risk time for anybody receiving mental health treatment is 7 days post-hospitalization. So I would really advocate that first week back at school, there's at least daily touch points. That looks different in every environment. And so I don't want to ask you to do something that is out of your scope or not, your districts won't allow or whatever that may be, but just understands that first 7 days is when post-hospitalization is when we actually see the highest suicide rates. So we really want to make sure we really do as much as we can to wrap around that student and that family really in the first month. So we really there's like two benchmarks. It's the 7 days and then the 30 days post-hospitalization, that if we can get past those two big hurdles, we have much better long-term outcomes. And integrating back home, again, we work a lot with families and really try to engage them as much as possible that, it's education, it is setting up routines for the family because, maybe they've never taken a daily medication before. So when do we put that into their daily routine? Is that makes sense for them and their family? Is that every night before they go to bed, when they brush their teeth, the medications are, being administered to the kid? And what do we do to keep that kid safe? We're not leaving the medication bottle out on the bathroom counter. What is a realistic but also safe option? And really having conversations with the kid and the parents prior to the kid coming home that we're doing safety sweeps. And this means that we're going through, and I tell kids all the time, I'm sorry if it's an invasion of your privacy, but the fact that we got to a hospitalization, we no longer get a chance to be private. We got to re-earn that trust. So yeah, mom and dad are going to go through your room before you go home. That is the reality of where we're at right now, is we want to make sure there aren't any pills hidden. There's no sharp objects. There's no, and talking with parents, because it's amazing to me, some of the things that I have seen over the years. I remember I had a young girl in my PHP setting before I lived in Dallas, where she was cutting. She was having some self-harming behaviors, and mom couldn't figure out where she was getting sharp objects because she had swept the room and really kind of made the environment as much as she thought she could safely. And when I was able to dig into it and find out from the girl, she was using from her eyeliner, the pencil sharpener from her eyeliner has a little razor on it. And so she was removing that. And but mom was watching her shave her legs. Mom was doing all the things that she thought she needed to do to try to keep her daughter safe. And she was still finding these cut marks on her, and she couldn't figure out where they were coming from. So I think it's important that we just build trust and have those conversations about why we're doing what we're doing. We're not just, barging into their room and tearing up the place and, treating them as if they are inmates and we're doing room sweeps, but rather that this is for your safety. And because we care so much about you, we want to remove any temptations. And so this is what we're doing to keep you safe. So for the sake of time, I want to be respectful of that and, give the opportunity for any questions. So any questions for me?
We have a question from Karen in, she has her hand up. If someone can unmute her, please.
Karen, you should be able to unmute now.
Do we have any other questions? Okay, well, oh, one more question from Nicole.
Hi, what is the protocol when they are sent back to school? Obviously, I know it's probably different per placement, but are they given any kind of direction on how to approach a counselor and or like safety plans needed to be met at school?
I can speak to my hospital as well as other hospitals I've worked at in the past. I can't speak to all of them. I will say the biggest barrier that I experience is the release of information. So we legally cannot even let the school know that the child is in our care if the parents do not complete a release of information. So our release of information for Millwood and our outpatient programs, they're called branches, is on our website. So as a school provider, if you're sending a child to a higher level of care, look on their website and see if there is that ROI form and send it, like have the parents fill it out before you even send them. If they are able to get that, or you have that, and you can always like scan or email it over to the therapist at the hospital setting, then we have that. And then we can release so much more information to you. So that's usually what I see is the biggest barrier. So at discharge, when a kid, even actually, this is not just a child, but anybody that is in our programs, when they discharge, we fax over or email, however that preferred form of communication, the medication list, the discharge summary, that crisis safety plan, and some other documentation. It's like a discharge packet to the next provider. So HIPAA allows us to send that to their outpatient therapist or their, if they're going to MHMR, or if they're going to, Warm Place, or wherever they may be going, that is a professional counselor or outpatient program, I can send that information to them. Schools, I have to have that ROI though. So that's where it's a struggle, because they do get like a letter that's kind of a generic one, just saying they were in our care from this date to this date. And that goes home with the parents as well too. So they get a nice little folder with all of that paperwork and that return to school letter. And the parents then are supposed to bring that to school. We can facilitate that by also sending it to school if the parents ask us to, or if we are able to get that ROI. But that's the biggest barrier I see, is getting that information to schools if the parents don't want to let us release it.
Thank you so much.
I just saw a comment about Pecan Valley. We send a lot to Pecan Valley out in that area. Pecan Valley MHMR, they are fantastic to work with. They get all, they really help with that warm handoff as well. So if you're in that area, they've got their whole services when it comes to crisis counselors. They come out and do the assessments to see what level of care they really need. They're really, really good about making sure that we go to the least restrictive environment. They're not recommending inpatient unless it's absolutely required. One thing I would say too is if you are referring to a higher level of care and the parents are resistant, please don't threaten to call CPS for them not being compliant with what your recommendation is. That makes it really difficult for us when they do show up, when they already have this hesitancy or resistance to treatment because they are coming in saying, I'm being voluntold for this program, and then trying to engage the child and the parents into the services we provide because they feel forced. It's really, really difficult. So we all are in this as mandated reporters that we're trying to keep the kids safe. But how do we work with them versus, if you don't do this, I'm calling CPS or I'm calling law enforcement. It makes it really difficult. And quite honestly, we don't have as good of outcomes when we do that.
There's another question from Teresa, who says she's a CASA. She had a child go to hospital for 7 days. Since this child was in a foster home, there's no family there for them. Is she missing out on proper care?
Yes. So we see this more often now too. So when a child's in foster care, even if they are, have a foster parent that thought they're going to return back to that foster placement at discharge, foster parents aren't even the ones that can consent to treatment. We have to have the caseworkers be the ones that sign the child in whenever they make any kind of medication adjustment. It's the caseworker that consents to that, not the foster parents or the CASA workers. So I would really, as a CASA, ask to be involved in that treatment planning, whether that be the treatment team meetings or the discharge meetings when they're talking about discharge and preparing the kiddo for discharge. Or if you're able to come to the family therapy session, because they can still do a family therapy session. Might be a little more case management based, where it's more education of how you can support them as a CASA, and come for visitation. So I don't know if everybody knows this, but during COVID, most hospitals stopped doing in-person visitation because of COVID. And it was probably 2 or 3 years ago. I want to say it was in 2021, if not 2022. It actually was a requirement from the government or from the governor that we resumed in-person visitation. So if you find out that one of your kiddos is in a hospital and they're saying that they don't do in-person visitation, like there's an executive order that we have to do in-person visitation. We also can allow for special visits. So if you're not able to come during that like designated time or whatever, especially for a CASA worker, speak with the leadership at that hospital to request a special visit outside of those visitation hours, or you can, meet with your kiddo. But you have that right as a CASA worker for sure.
Okay, and if a student continues to self-harm, what are some things that we can do to continue to reduce these behaviors in school?
In school. Again, always go back to what your school district will allow, because I don't want to give recommendations that may get somebody in trouble because I don't work in a school environment. But if you are able to, and I would engage the student in those conversations too, like making it be a mutual thing of like, we're doing this to help you in a way, where can we search their locker and their desk every day, and identifying what those triggers may be for them self-harming. Self-harming to me was really interesting when I worked with middle school girls, because what I really saw, and a lot of the research shows, is it's really not a suicide attempt, or most of the time. Sometimes it is, but most of the time it's really more of a negative coping skill. And what I really find to be the most effective interventions is similar interventions that I use with people struggling with addiction, because it really is same concept. It's the sensations that they're craving, or they're trying to dissociate from other negative feelings or distract from that. So identifying what the root or the trigger is for that self-harming behaviors, and then it's similar to safety planning, is when I feel like I'm going to harm, what are the things that trigger that, help them raise awareness to that, what are alternatives that I can do. A lot of people will recommend squeezing ice cubes, and I do not, because what I have seen with that is then it turns into, there was a while something going viral around on social media where they were basically creating chemical burns with salt and ice. And so I actually found that to be it turned negative to have squeezing ice cubes when wanting that similar sensation. So finding other healthy coping skills that help them, and it's going to be different for every person. But start with safety first, making sure they don't have any of the objects to hurt themselves. Like I said, pencil sharpeners, I would have never thought. But in a school environment, hair clips, I've seen even things like I've seen actually as a kind of a positive alternative, like hair ties, as long as they don't have the metal clip on them, where they'll use that and kind of snap that, or like a rubber band on their wrist instead. There's a lot of different alternatives, and I think it really just kind of depends kid to kid of you really got to figure out what the trigger is and the motivating factor, and then work with that to find an alternative.
Thank you. I see that we have one more question, but before we get to that, I want to share a little bit more about the evaluation link. So please make note that please make note of the email you use when filling out the evaluation. When you submit your completed evaluation, a CEU certificate will be sent to the email address you've entered, so you can access it and print it later.